My name is Claire Sterling. I am 31 years old and I work as a corporate tax accountant and auditor. 3 years ago, I stood shivering in the freezing Portland rain as my own mother hurled black garbage bags full of my clothes onto the wet asphalt, looking at me with pure disgust and calling me deadweight. Last Tuesday, that same woman kicked open the mahogany doors of my $3 million estate, completely unaware that she was trespassing into the very trap that would send her golden boy son to federal prison. Before I tell you how I brought my own family to their knees, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. Now let me take you back to the night I lost everything. I was 28 years old. The rain was coming down in heavy, relentless sheets, soaking right through my thin jacket as I stood on the front porch of the house I grew up in. The porch light flickered above me, casting long, harsh shadows across the faces of the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My mother, Patricia, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. My older brother, Bradley, stood right behind her, holding another large black trash bag filled with my personal belongings. "Mom, please," I begged. My voice shook so hard I could barely form the words. "Just give me 1 month. I just need 30 days to get back on my feet. You know I do not have a single dollar left to my name." Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He swung his arm and tossed the trash bag past me onto the wet driveway. It hit the pavement with a heavy thud, splitting open at the plastic seam and spilling my carefully folded sweaters directly into the muddy puddles. "You do not have a dollar left because you are an absolute idiot, Claire," Bradley sneered, pointing a finger at my face. "We told you to stop throwing money into a bottomless pit. We told you it was a waste. But no, you just had to play the hero, did you not?" I was talking about our father. My dad had passed away just 2 weeks earlier after a brutal, agonizing 2-year battle with terminal cancer. From the very moment of his diagnosis, Patricia and Bradley had treated his illness like nothing more than a minor inconvenience to their comfortable lives. They flatly refused to dip into their savings to help him. They refused to alter their daily routines. While I drained my entire life savings, cashed out my retirement accounts early, and maxed out every single credit card in my name to pay for Dad's experimental treatments and round-the-clock nursing care, Patricia and Bradley went on a luxury European vacation. They posted photos of themselves, enjoying wine tastings in Tuscany and sunbathing in the south of France, all while I sat in sterile, incredibly cold hospital rooms, holding Dad's frail hand and listening to the rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor. I fed him, I bathed him, and I watched the man who raised me slowly fade away. I looked at my mother standing warm and dry in the foyer, desperate for just a shred of maternal empathy. I paid for his care because he was my father. I cried the freezing rain, mixing with the hot tears streaming down my face. I paid for everything because neither of you would step up and do the right thing. He was your husband, Mom. He provided for you his entire life. How can you stand there and hold that against me?" Patricia's eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the Portland storm. She adjusted the collar of her expensive cashmere cardigan, taking a small step back to make sure the wind did not blow rain onto her pristine hardwood floors. "Do not try to guilt-trip me, Claire," she said sharply, her tone completely devoid of any warmth. "You chose to play the martyr. You made the conscious decision to bankrupt yourself for medical treatments the doctors clearly said would not work anyway." Bradley and I accepted reality. We knew he was dying, and we were moving on with our lives. You decided to drag yourself down with him, and now you expect us to pay for your bad financial decisions. "I am not asking you to pay for anything," I pleaded, stepping closer to the door, desperate to appeal to any remaining sense of family duty. "I am just asking to sleep in my old bedroom, just until my next paycheck clears. The final hospital bills took everything I had left. The bank froze my primary checking account yesterday. I literally have nowhere else to go tonight." Bradley leaned against the doorframe, a cruel, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "I saw that bank statement you left on the kitchen counter." He taunted thoroughly, enjoying my humiliation. Negative $420, a supposedly smart, educated corporate tax accountant with a negative bank balance. It is truly pathetic. You are 28 years old, Claire. You should be deeply embarrassed to come crawling back here, begging us for a handout. The physical reality of their betrayal hit me harder than the freezing wind. Over the past 2 years, I had given up my nice apartment to move into a tiny, cheap rental closer to the oncology ward. When that got too expensive, I moved my remaining belongings into my mother's dusty garage. I spent my nights sleeping on a small, uncomfortable cot beside Dad's rented hospital bed, right there in their living room, staying awake to give him his pain medication so my mother would not have to interrupt her sleep schedule. Now that he was gone, I had clearly outlived my usefulness. I had spent every penny and every ounce of my energy keeping the man we all loved alive, and their immediate response was to literally throw me out into the street with the trash. "I am your daughter," I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of the realization. "I took care of Dad when you abandoned him. How can you do this to me? Where am I supposed to go in this storm?" Patricia looked me up and down. There was absolutely no pity in her gaze. There was no maternal instinct, no hesitation, no guilt. There was only a deep, profound irritation. She looked at me the exact same way someone looks at a stray dog that wandered onto their perfectly manicured lawn. "This family does not harbor bankrupt failures," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly serious register. "You are a sinking ship, Claire, and we aren't drowning with you." Before I could even open my mouth to say another word, she stepped back and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut in my face. I heard the heavy metal deadbolt click firmly into place. The absolute finality of that sound echoed in the damp, freezing air. I stood there on the porch for a very long time, shivering uncontrollably, staring at the closed door. I kept hoping it was just a sick joke or a momentary lapse of judgment. I kept hoping the door would swing open and my mother would tell me to stop being dramatic and come inside out of the cold. But the porch light flicked off, plunging me into complete and utter darkness. They were really gone. I was entirely alone. My hands were numb as I walked down the driveway. I knelt on the wet asphalt and began stuffing my soaked sweaters back into the torn plastic garbage bags. Every movement felt heavy, like I was moving through deep water. I managed to salvage what I could and shoved it all into the single canvas duffel bag I had brought with me. My phone screen was cracked and the battery was flashing red at 10%. I stood under a street lamp, water pouring down my face, and called the cheapest local cab company I could find. The ride across town was a blur of neon signs bleeding through the rain-slicked windows. I counted the crumpled dollar bills in my wallet. I had exactly $43 in cash. That was the entirety of my net worth. The cab driver dropped me off at a seedy, run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. The neon vacancy sign buzzed and flickered above the front office. The manager behind the bulletproof glass barely looked at me as I handed over $40 for a single night in their cheapest room. I walked down the exterior corridor, the wind howling around the concrete pillars, and unlocked the door to room number 12. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach hit me immediately. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the bedspread looked like it had not been washed in a decade. I dropped my soaking wet duffel bag onto the floor and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app one last time. I stared at the red numbers on the screen. -$420. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had happily transferred to the hospital billing department. I thought about the late notices I had ignored because buying my father his pain medication was more important than paying my own credit card minimums. I had done everything right. I had been the good daughter. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace of mind, and my entire financial future for my family. And my reward was sitting in a freezing, filthy motel room with $3 left in my pocket. I walked into the tiny, moldy bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was plastered to my skull. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked pathetic. I looked exactly like the broken, bankrupt failure my mother had just accused me of being. But as I stared at my reflection in that cracked mirror, something deep inside my chest began to harden. The overwhelming grief over losing my father was still there, but the desperate, aching need for my mother's love and my brother's approval completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. They had assumed I was weak. They had assumed that because I was willing to sacrifice everything for love, I was a fool who could be easily discarded when I was no longer useful to them. They thought they had seen the last of me. They thought they had successfully cut away the dead weight, so they could continue living their privileged, selfish lives without consequence. I gripped the edges of the bathroom sink until my knuckles turned white. I made a promise to myself right then and there, a vow spoken to the empty, quiet room. I would survive this. I would rebuild my life from absolute zero. I would work harder and smarter than anyone else in this city. I would reclaim my career as a tax accountant, and I would learn exactly how money and power truly operated. And I swore with every ounce of breath left in my lungs that I would never, ever let anyone use me or discard me again. I took off my wet clothes, wrapped myself in the thin, scratchy motel blanket, and lay down on the bed. I did not cry anymore. I listened to the rain beating against the window pane, and I began to plan my next move. The next morning, I would wake up and start the brutal, exhausting process of clawing my way back to the surface. I would endure the 80-hour work weeks. I would endure the stress and the exhaustion. But I would never forget the sound of that deadbolt locking me out in the cold. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of grinding, relentless work. 3 years of transforming myself from a desperate, bankrupt girl into a woman who understood exactly how to protect herself. I did not know it on that rainy night, but the very skills I would use to rebuild my own life would eventually become the exact weapons I needed to dismantle theirs. I just had to be patient. I just had to wait for them to make a mistake. And eventually, driven by their own boundless greed and breathtaking arrogance, they did exactly that. The morning after my mother locked me out in the freezing rain, I woke up in that filthy motel room and went straight to work. I did not have the luxury of grief, and I certainly did not have the luxury of time. I had exactly $43 left to my name, and survival was the only thing on my mind. I put on the only clean suit I had managed to stuff into my duffel bag. I ironed it using a rusty iron. I borrowed from the motel front desk and marched downtown. Within a week, I managed to secure a position at a high-pressure corporate accounting firm. It was a brutal environment, a meat grinder of an office, where junior accountants were routinely expected to work themselves to the bone. They wanted machines, not people. I took the job without a single second of hesitation. I embraced the punishing schedule. I worked 80 hours a week because I had absolutely nowhere else to go. My tiny rented room was empty and cold, so I practically lived at my desk. I arrived before the sun came up and left long after the streetlights flickered on. I survived on stale break room coffee protein bars and sheer, unadulterated anger. Every single time my vision blurred from staring at spreadsheets, every time my back ached from sitting in that rigid office chair, I forced myself to remember the sound of that heavy deadbolt sliding into place on my mother's front door. I remembered my brother laughing as my carefully folded sweaters sank into the muddy driveway puddles. That memory was my fuel. I promised myself I would build an absolute fortress of financial security so that nobody could ever throw me away again. I became ruthless in my efficiency. I was the first to arrive, the last to leave, and the only auditor who never complained about the workload. 3 months into my grueling schedule, the senior partner called me into his glass-walled office. He dropped a massive, disorganized stack of manila folders and loose receipts onto my desk. He told me it was the Hughes account. He explained that the client was a wealthy, elderly widow named Evelyn Hughes, and her financial files were a complete and total disaster. His exact instructions were to just clean it up, push the paperwork through the system, and not ask too many questions. He said her nephew, a man named Richard, was handling her day-to-day affairs, and the firm just needed to rubber stamp the annual audit to keep the billable hours flowing. I nodded, took the massive stack of files, and carried them back to my desk. But the moment I opened the very first ledger, my instincts screamed that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. I am an auditor by trade and by nature. I understand how money moves, and numbers always tell a story. The story hidden inside Evelyn Hughes's financial records was absolutely terrifying. I spent 3 consecutive nights sitting alone in the dark office, tracing the flow of money. There were multiple unauthorized withdrawals from her high-yield savings accounts. There were forged signatures on property tax documents, signed in a handwriting that clearly did not match Evelyn's delicate script. There were massive, unexplained wire transfers being routed to obscure shell corporations listed under vague consulting titles. Someone was bleeding this elderly woman, dry siphoning off her massive wealth while she was still alive to watch it happen. I refused to simply rubber stamp the theft. I refused to look the other way just to appease a senior partner. I gathered the most glaring discrepancies into a comprehensive file and requested an immediate in-person meeting with the client, much to the loud annoyance of my supervisors. I did not care. I needed to see Evelyn Hughes face to face. I drove out to Evelyn's estate the following afternoon. It was a massive, breathtaking property tucked away in the wealthy, quiet hills outside the city. It was the kind of $3 million estate that featured grand stone pillars, sweeping driveways, and expansive gardens. But as I walked up the stone pathway, I noticed the subtle, heartbreaking signs of intentional neglect. The magnificent rose bushes were wildly overgrown and dying. The paint on the grand window trim was peeling, and the heavy mahogany front door took far too long to open. When the door finally creaked open, I met Evelyn Hughes. She was 75 years old, sitting quietly in a motorized velvet wheelchair. Her body was incredibly frail, ravaged by illness and the natural cruelty of age, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and piercingly aware. She looked at me with a profound, quiet weariness that I recognized instantly. It was the exact same look my father had during his final agonizing weeks in the oncology ward. It was the look of someone who knew their body was failing and who knew the people hovering around them were just impatiently waiting for the end to arrive. I sat across from Evelyn in her grand, dimly lit living room, spreading the financial documents and highlighted bank statements across the antique coffee table. I walked her through the discrepancies I had found, treating her with the absolute professional respect she deserved. I watched her face closely as I pointed out the fraudulent transfers. She was not surprised by the missing funds. She did not gasp or express shock. She just looked incredibly, overwhelmingly sad. She told me about her nephew, Richard. He was her late husband's nephew and her only remaining connection to family. She explained how Richard had systematically and slowly isolated her from her lifelong friends. He had fired her loyal household staff, one by one, replacing them with cheap, unreliable contractors. He had taken complete control of her incoming mail and her private telephone line. He constantly told her she was too old, too sick, and too confused to understand her own money. He was financially and emotionally suffocating her, waiting for her frail body to finally give out, so he could claim everything she and her husband had spent a lifetime building. Looking at Evelyn sitting in that massive, lonely house, I felt a physical ache in my chest. The parallel was impossible to ignore. I saw my dying father in her trembling hands. I saw the absolute vulnerability of trusting the wrong people at the very end of your life. My mother and brother had abandoned my father when he was weak and defenseless, stripping away his dignity to preserve their own comfort. Now, Richard was doing the exact same thing to Evelyn, treating her life like nothing more than an obstacle standing between him and a payout. Right in the middle of our quiet conversation, the telephone on the side table rang. The sound was harsh and jarring, echoing loudly against the high ceilings. Evelyn physically flinched. She stared at the caller ID display and her breathing hitched. She looked absolutely terrified. I watched her frail hands shake as she slowly picked up the receiver and pressed the speakerphone button, just as she had apparently been conditioned to do. Richard's voice immediately filled the room. He did not say hello. He did not ask how she was feeling or if she had eaten that day. He just started screaming. He demanded to know why she had not yet signed the comprehensive power of attorney documents he had sent over by courier the previous afternoon. His voice was dripping with venom, entitlement, and raw aggression. He called her an ungrateful old burden. He told her she was losing her mind and completely incapable of making basic decisions. He warned her that if she did not sign those specific legal papers by tomorrow morning, he was going to petition a judge to declare her incompetent, force her into a miserable state-run nursing facility, and take the house anyway. He told her she had no power, no choices, and absolutely no one left in the world to protect her. Something feral and unyielding snapped inside me. The polite professional boundaries of a corporate junior accountant vanished entirely. I was suddenly 28 years old again, standing in the freezing Portland rain, being told I was a burden and a sinking ship. I was sitting beside my dying father, while my family selfishly vacationed in Europe, feeling entirely helpless. I was not helpless anymore. I reached across the antique coffee table and pulled the phone directly out of Evelyn's trembling hands. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of someone who knows exactly how to destroy a financial predator. I introduced myself. I told Richard my full name and my title. I told him I was a licensed corporate tax auditor, currently sitting in his aunt's living room, officially reviewing her accounts. The silence on his end of the line was immediate, thick, and incredibly satisfying. I did not give him a chance to recover. I told him I had spent the last 48 hours tracking the fraudulent wire transfers he had illegally authorized from Evelyn's primary checking and investment accounts. I recited the exact dollar amounts of the stolen funds. I recited the routing numbers of his hidden shell companies and the dates of the forged property tax documents. I told him that attempting to coerce an elderly individual into signing a power of attorney document while actively embezzling her funds constitutes criminal elder financial abuse under state law, not to mention a massive litany of federal tax fraud violations. Richard began to sputter, his towering arrogance completely evaporating into a desperate, chaotic panic. He tried to threaten me, his voice wavering as he told me I was just a lowly, disposable accountant who had no idea who I was messing with. He shouted that he would call my managing partner and have me fired before the end of the business day. He promised he would ruin my career. I smiled, looking directly at Evelyn as I answered him. I told him to go ahead and make that phone call. I explained in excruciating detail that if he contacted my firm, or if he ever raised his voice at Evelyn again, I would bypass civil court entirely. I promised him I would personally package every single forged check, every fake contractor invoice, and every unauthorized bank transfer, and deliver the entire dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I explained exactly what the federal mandatory minimum penalties were for his specific brand of corporate tax evasion. I painted a very clear, highly detailed picture of the federal prison cell he would occupy if he ever threatened this vulnerable woman again. The line went completely dead. He hung up. He was a coward, just like my brother and just like my mother. Bullies always crumble when someone finally stands their ground, looks them in the eye, and strips away their false authority. I placed the phone back on the receiver and slowly exhaled, letting the professional composure settle back over my shoulders. I turned to look at Evelyn, suddenly worried I had overstepped my professional bounds. I had likely just cost my firm a massive, lucrative client account, and I was fully prepared to pack up my desk and be fired the moment I walked back into the downtown office. But Evelyn was not angry. The sheer terror that had clouded her face just moments before was completely gone. She sat up straighter in her velvet wheelchair, staring at me with a mixture of profound relief and deep, absolute respect. She had spent years surrounded by greedy relatives and apathetic professionals who viewed her as a target or a nuisance. She realized in that exact moment that I was the very first person in a long, dark time who had actively stood between her and the wolves. She reached out across the table and placed her fragile, trembling hand firmly over mine. She asked me to quit my job at the accounting firm. She told me she did not want a corporate auditor who was only interested in billable hours. She wanted me. She asked me to become her private financial fiduciary, to take complete and total control of her entire estate, and to help her build an impenetrable legal wall to keep Richard out forever. She was offering me a lifeline, a lucrative way out of the brutal 80-hour corporate grind, but she was also offering me a war. By accepting her offer, I would be stepping into a massive fortune and placing myself on a direct, unavoidable collision course with a desperate and incredibly greedy man. I looked at the financial documents scattered across the table. Then I looked into Evelyn's fierce, determined eyes, and I told her yes. The very next morning, after my conversation with Evelyn, I walked directly into the glass-walled office of my managing partner and handed in my resignation. He laughed in my face. He sat back in his expensive leather chair and told me I was throwing away a promising corporate career to play nursemaid for a dying woman who would likely forget my name by next month. I did not waste a single breath arguing with him. I packed my desk into a single cardboard box, walked out of that towering downtown high-rise, and never looked back. I drove straight to Evelyn Hughes's estate and moved my makeshift office directly into her sprawling, dusty library. The room smelled of aged leather, dried ink, and years of profound neglect. I set up my dual monitors on a massive antique mahogany desk, surrounded myself with banker's boxes full of crumpled receipts, and went to work. Evelyn's financial records were an absolute nightmare. Richard had intentionally created a convoluted, chaotic labyrinth of transactions, specifically designed to overwhelm and exhaust anyone who tried to look too closely at the numbers. He had moved money between obscure holding accounts, mislabeled massive withdrawals as simple administrative fees, and buried thousands of dollars of personal expenses under the guise of estate management. But Richard had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that an overworked junior auditor at a massive corporate firm would simply skim the top sheet, complain about the mess, and stamp the approval just to hit their billable hours. He never anticipated that someone with 80-hour work weeks of pure, uninterrupted rage driving them would sit down and trace every single penny. I spent 2 straight weeks locked in that library, eating cold sandwiches and drinking lukewarm coffee, building a massive digital spreadsheet that tracked 15 years of Evelyn's wealth. It started with a recurring pattern I noticed in the property maintenance ledger. Every single month for the past 3 years, a massive wire transfer was initiated from Evelyn's primary high-yield investment account to a local contracting firm. The invoices attached to these wire transfers were incredibly vague and poorly detailed. They cited extensive landscaping overhauls, custom roof repairs, premium window replacements, and emergency plumbing services. The amounts were absolutely staggering. $12,000 one month, $18,000 the next. According to these official invoices, Evelyn's estate should have looked like a pristine, freshly renovated palace. But I had walked the grounds with Evelyn. I had seen the overgrown, dying rose bushes choking the cracked stone pathways. I had felt the winter draft blowing straight through the rotting wooden frames of the conservatory windows. I had listened to the ancient boiler groaning and struggling to heat the massive drafty house. Absolutely zero maintenance work had been done. The invoices were completely fabricated. I pulled up the state business registry database on my monitor and typed in the name of the vendor. Apex Heritage Construction. I watched the loading icon spin on my screen, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest as I waited for the public records to load. When the official state registration document populated on my screen, the air physically left my lungs. I stared at the name listed under the primary registered agent, Bradley Sterling, my older brother. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk so hard, my fingers cramped. My mind was spinning violently as a sickening, horrifying reality locked perfectly into place. Just a few months prior, during one of the rare moments I had checked my mother's public social media profile, I had seen a post celebrating Bradley's recent marriage. My mother had bragged endlessly about Bradley marrying into a wonderful, incredibly wealthy family. The bride was a snobby, status-obsessed woman named Chloe. Chloe was Richard's daughter. My brother had married Evelyn's great-niece. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random contractor being overpaid. This was a highly organized, predatory alliance of absolute greed. Richard and Bradley were working side by side. Richard used his unmonitored access to Evelyn's accounts as her financial proxy to approve massive fraudulent payments. Bradley generated the fake construction invoices through his shell company to make the transfers look legitimate to the bank. They were systematically bleeding an elderly, defenseless woman dry. They were splitting the stolen cash to fund their luxurious lifestyles, buying expensive cars and taking European vacations, while her actual home crumbled around her, and her health rapidly failed. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. When my mother and brother had thrown my belongings onto the freezing driveway 3 years ago, calling me a bankrupt failure, I thought they were just cruel and selfish. I thought they were just protecting their own comfort and refusing to take responsibility for our dying father. But this proved they were much worse than selfish. They were active, calculating predators. My own family was building their immense wealth by financially abusing a dying woman. They were doing to Evelyn exactly what they had done to my father, stripping away her dignity and her security for their own gain. Only this time, they were getting rich off the cruelty. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt a surge of cold, absolute clarity wash over my entire body, starting from my chest and radiating all the way out to my fingertips. I picked up the heavy telephone on Evelyn's desk and dialed Richard's direct corporate line. He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with his usual impatient arrogance. I was clearly expecting to bully his frail aunt into signing more legal documents. Instead, he got me. I did not offer a polite greeting. I spoke with the icy, unwavering precision of someone who is holding a loaded weapon and knows exactly how to use it. I told him the game was completely over. I informed him that I had formally resigned from my corporate firm and assumed the role of Evelyn's private financial fiduciary. I laid out the exact details of what I had found in the ledgers. I named his fake landscaping invoices. I named his daughter Chloe. I named my brother Bradley. I told him I knew exactly how he was laundering Evelyn's inheritance through Apex Heritage Construction. The silence on his end of the phone was heavy, thick, and incredibly satisfying. For a few long seconds, I could hear him breathing desperately, trying to process how his perfect hidden scheme had just been detonated by a stranger. Then his shock morphed into a towering, aggressive rage. He began to shout, his voice echoing loudly through the receiver. He called me a liar. He told me I was nothing but a glorified calculator, a bitter, insignificant little desk worker who was completely out of her depth. He threatened to drag me through the mud, to tie me up in so much litigation that my accounting license would be permanently revoked. He promised to send the police to the estate and have me arrested for holding his aunt hostage. He told me I had absolutely no power and that he controlled everything. I let him finish his tantrum. I let him scream until his voice literally cracked. Then, I leaned into the phone and calmly told him that he was entirely wrong. I informed him that 2 hours prior to this phone call, I had loaded Evelyn into my car and personally wheeled her into the manager's office at her primary bank. I told him we had sat across from the branch president and formally, legally revoked his signatory power on every single account, trust, and safety deposit box associated with the Hughes name. His access was completely, permanently, and irrevocably denied. I told him that if he ever tried to contact Evelyn again, or if he ever set foot on the estate grounds, I would hand-deliver my massive audit binder directly to the federal authorities. I hung up the phone while he was still screaming my name. I turned around and saw Evelyn sitting in her wheelchair near the library doorway. She had listened to the entire exchange in total silence. A faint, incredibly proud smile rested on her lips, but her breathing was dangerously shallow, and her frail hands gripped the armrests of her chair until her knuckles were stark white. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, revealing the brutal reality of her physical condition. The sheer stress of discovering the true depth of her nephew's betrayal was taking a severe and immediate toll on her failing heart. Over the next 2 weeks, her health declined with terrifying speed. Hospital beds and oxygen tanks replaced the antique furniture in her bedroom. The vibrant, sharp spark in her eyes began to dim, replaced by a heavy, weary fog that broke my heart to witness. She spent most of her days confined to her bed, far too weak to sit in the conservatory and look out at her gardens. One rainy afternoon, she called me to her bedside. Her voice was barely a whisper, forcing me to lean in close to her pillow just to hear her words, but her mind was still incredibly sharp. She knew exactly what Richard and Bradley would do the absolute second her heart stopped beating. She knew they would immediately contest a standard will. She knew they would claim she was mentally unfit, argue that she had been maliciously manipulated by a rogue accountant, and tie the estate up in probate court for years until I was completely drained of financial resources. She reached out with a trembling hand and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. She told me we needed a weapon they could not possibly fight. She asked me to pick up the phone and find the most ruthless, aggressive estate attorney in the entire city. We needed to draft an ironclad defense immediately, because she knew just as I did that the real war was just about to begin. The very next morning, after my conversation with Evelyn, I made the most important phone call of my entire life. I reached out to a man named Arthur Harrison. Mr. Harrison was a senior partner at one of the most feared corporate law firms in the state. He was not the kind of lawyer who negotiated settlements. He was the kind of lawyer who built impenetrable legal fortresses. I explained Evelyn's highly sensitive situation over the phone. I told him about the forged invoices, the fake contracting company operated by my brother Bradley, and Richard's relentless psychological abuse. Mr. Harrison was sitting in Evelyn's library exactly 2 hours later. He listened to her story in complete silence. He carefully reviewed the thick audit binder I had put together over my sleepless nights. Then he looked at Evelyn and told her exactly how they were going to sever Richard's greedy hands from her wealth permanently. A standard last will and testament would simply not be enough. Mr. Harrison explained that Richard would easily tie up a standard will in probate court for years. He would use his substantial wealth to freeze the assets, starve me of legal funding, and force a desperate settlement. We needed something completely bulletproof. We needed an irrevocable trust. Mr. Harrison spoke with a calm, commanding authority as he outlined the strategy. By transferring all of her physical property, her vast investment portfolios, and her liquid cash into an irrevocable trust, the assets would bypass the probate process entirely upon her death. Richard would have absolutely zero legal standing to contest the transfer because the estate would essentially no longer belong to Evelyn as an individual. It would belong to the trust. And Evelyn made it incredibly clear who would control that trust. She looked Mr. Harrison right in the eye and named me as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. I sat in that dusty library absolutely stunned as she signed the preliminary documents. I told her it was far too much. I told her I just wanted to protect her, not take her money. Evelyn reached out and held my hand with a surprisingly firm grip. She told me I had given her back her dignity when her own blood had tried to strip it away. She said I was the daughter she never had, and she wanted her legacy to be in the hands of someone who truly understood the value of hard work and genuine compassion. The paperwork was drafted, notarized, and filed with astonishing speed. The trap was officially set. Those legal documents were signed just in time. Over the next 3 weeks, Evelyn's health faded with a heartbreaking inevitability. The vibrant, sharp-witted woman who had trusted me to audit her life was slowly slipping away into a quiet, peaceful sleep. I did not leave her side for a single moment. I moved my few belongings from my cheap rented room directly into the guest suite down the hall from her bedroom. I worked on my laptop from a small chair right beside her bed. I read classic novels out loud to her when she was too tired to speak. I made sure her final days were filled with warmth, absolute respect, and profound safety. I gave her the exact same devotion I had given my own father during his agonizing battle with terminal cancer. The profound difference was that Evelyn actually recognized my sacrifice. She thanked me for it every single day. She made me feel seen, valued, and unconditionally loved. She healed a massive bleeding wound inside my chest that my own mother had ripped wide open 3 years ago. Evelyn passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning just as the sun was coming up. The massive house was completely silent. I held her fragile hand as she took her final breath, and I wept for the loss of a woman who had shown me more maternal grace in a few short months than Patricia had shown me in my entire lifetime. The funeral was held exactly 1 week later. It was a beautiful, deeply dignified service at a historic stone church in the center of the city. I arranged for a spectacular floral display of white lilies and fresh roses, the exact flowers Evelyn had always loved to see in her gardens. I sat in the very front row, wearing a simple black dress, mourning the passing of a truly remarkable soul. But as I sat there listening to the choir sing a soft hymn, I could not help but notice the crushing, insulting emptiness of the church pews behind me. Richard did not attend. His status-obsessed daughter Chloe did not attend. My brother Bradley did not attend. They were Evelyn's only remaining family by marriage, and they did not even bother to show up to pay their final respects. It was a level of emotional bankruptcy that made my blood run absolutely cold. I sat in that quiet church, and I knew exactly why they were not there. They were incredibly arrogant. They assumed they had already won the ultimate prize. They believed that because Evelyn had passed away, her assets were completely frozen in the complex, slow-moving gears of the probate court system. They assumed the massive $3 million estate, the millions in high-yield investment accounts, and the historic property were just sitting there waiting for Richard to waltz into a courtroom and claim his prize as the closest living relative. They thought they had all the time in the world. They thought I was just a disposable, irrelevant accountant who would quickly pack up my bags and fade back into obscurity now that my wealthy client was dead. They had absolutely no idea about the irrevocable trust. They had no idea that Mr. Harrison had already filed the final paperwork, legally transferring every single ounce of Evelyn's power and wealth directly into my hands. The day after the funeral, Mr. Harrison called me into his pristine downtown office. He slid a heavy ring of brass keys across his polished wooden desk. He looked at me with a very serious, unyielding expression that made me sit up perfectly straight in my chair. He told me that a vacant $3 million property was a massive liability. He explained that Richard was a desperate, incredibly greedy man who was used to getting his own way through sheer intimidation. It was highly likely that Richard would attempt to send a private locksmith to the estate, change the heavy deadbolts, and take physical possession of the house under the false pretense of protecting his late aunt's assets. Mr. Harrison told me I needed to establish immediate, undeniable physical residency. I had to move into the primary master suite. I had to park my car in the main driveway. I had to make it abundantly clear to anyone who drove past those wrought iron gates that the house had a rightful legal owner who was not going to back down. So I packed up my single canvas duffel bag of clothes and drove back to the estate. Walking through those grand mahogany doors as the actual legal owner of the property felt incredibly surreal. The house was massive, beautifully quiet, and deeply peaceful. For the first time in my entire adult life, I did not have to worry about working 80 hours a week just to make rent. I did not have to fear being thrown out into the freezing rain by people who viewed me as a burden. I spent the first few weeks thoroughly cleaning the massive house, letting the physical labor ground me in my new reality. I hired professional, legitimate landscapers to restore Evelyn's dying rose bushes and clear the overgrown stone pathways. I organized my new home office in the grand library, setting up my monitors on the same mahogany desk where we had signed the trust documents. I drank my morning coffee in the sunlit conservatory, looking out over the rolling green hills of the property. I finally felt safe. I finally felt like I had a true home that nobody could ever take away from me. I had meticulously followed every legal rule, I had protected a vulnerable woman, and I had secured my future. That profound peace lasted exactly 1 month. It was a beautiful, unseasonably warm Sunday afternoon in early autumn. I was sitting comfortably in a plush velvet armchair in the conservatory, reading a novel and enjoying the quiet hum of the garden outside. The sunlight was pouring through the tall glass windows, warming the intricate hardwood floors. It was a perfect, silent day. Then the harsh, aggressive crunch of gravel completely shattered the silence. I lowered my book and looked out through the large bay windows. A brand new, gleaming black Mercedes SUV was tearing up the long, winding driveway. The vehicle was moving far too fast, kicking up heavy clouds of dust and loose stones as it completely ignored the posted speed limit signs on the private road. The SUV slammed on its brakes, coming to a sudden, screeching halt right in the middle of the circular turnaround directly in front of the main entrance. The heavy doors flew open, and my stomach instantly dropped into a cold, heavy knot. My brother Bradley stepped out of the driver's side. He was wearing an expensive designer polo shirt and a smug, wildly entitled grin. His new wife Chloe stepped out of the passenger side, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and looking up at the historic property with undisguised greed. And then the rear door opened. My mother, Patricia, stepped out onto the pristine paving stones. She looked exactly the same as she had on the night she threw me out into the street. She wore an expensive cashmere cardigan and that same expression of profound, arrogant superiority. I watched in absolute silence from the conservatory window as the three of them stood in my driveway like conquering royalty. Bradley pointed up at the massive second-story master suite, laughing and saying something to Chloe that made her clap her hands together in delight. Patricia placed her hands on her hips, nodding approvingly as she surveyed the sweeping gardens and the grand stone pillars. They were pointing at the historic architecture, pointing at the restored gardens, and pointing at the heavy mahogany doors like they had just won the lottery. They were looking at my home exactly like they already owned it. I slowly closed my book and placed it gently on the side table. My heart was pounding a slow, methodical drumbeat, echoing in my chest. The predators had finally arrived to claim their unearned prize. They were absolutely convinced they were walking into an empty house, ready to take possession of a dead woman's legacy. They had no idea who was waiting for them inside. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my clothes, and began walking toward the front foyer to unlock the door. I walked slowly from the sunlit conservatory toward the grand foyer. The thick Persian carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps, leaving the house incredibly quiet. I did not rush. I wanted to hear exactly how they spoke when they thought nobody was listening. Before I even reached the main hallway, I heard the distinct sharp scrape of a brass key sliding into the massive front deadbolt. My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs. Bradley had actually done it. He had taken a key directly from Richard's private office. I was so blindingly arrogant, so completely consumed by greed, that he could not even wait for a judge to look at a single piece of paper. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a loud, echoing groan. A gust of crisp autumn air swept into the pristine foyer, bringing with it the loud, abrasive voices of the people who had destroyed my youth. "Look at this place," Bradley said, his voice booming off the high vaulted ceilings. His footsteps echoed heavily on the imported marble tiles. "I told you it was an absolute goldmine, Chloe. Look at that chandelier. That has to be worth 50 grand all by itself." "It smells like an old hospital," Chloe complained. Her high heels clicked sharply against the stone floor. "We are absolutely gutting this entire level. I want open concept. I want white marble. We are going to have to rip out all this depressing dark wood immediately. But the square footage is incredible. Daddy was right. This is the perfect wedding gift." And then I heard my mother. Patricia stepped into the foyer with a deep, dramatic sigh of pure satisfaction. "It is about time our family caught a real break," she said, her voice dripping with extreme entitlement. "After all the stress we have been under, after everything we have endured, we deserve a home like this." Richard promised us the best, and he certainly delivered. I stood absolutely perfectly still in the shadows at the very top of the grand staircase. I looked down at the three of them. They were wandering around the foyer, pointing at Evelyn's precious antique furniture, laughing about which pieces they were going to throw into a dumpster. They were completely violating the sacred space of a woman who had died just weeks ago. They felt absolutely no grief. They felt no respect. They only felt a ravenous, consuming hunger for things they had never earned. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows. I began to slowly descend the grand, sweeping staircase. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting my hand glide smoothly along the polished wooden banister. I did not say a single word. I simply let the sharp, rhythmic sound of my shoes striking the wooden stairs echo through the massive room. Patricia was the very first person to look up. She froze right in the middle of the foyer. Her hand, which had been pointing at a beautiful landscape painting, dropped slowly to her side. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from her face, replaced instantly by a look of profound, utter confusion. She blinked hard, as if she was staring at a ghost. "Claire," she whispered. The sound of my name on her lips felt like a curse. Bradley and Chloe spun around immediately. Bradley's jaw actually dropped open. He stared at me, descending the stairs, his eyes wide with absolute shock. For 5 incredibly long seconds, nobody moved. The massive foyer was completely dead silent. They were trying to process the absolute impossibility of seeing the bankrupt failure of the family standing inside a $3 million estate. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the marble floor. I folded my hands neatly in front of me and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I did not look angry. I did not look scared. I looked at her with the cold, detached professionalism of an auditor examining a highly suspicious tax return. "Hello, Patricia," I said softly. "Hello, Bradley. You are trespassing." For a moment, they were too stunned to speak. But then, the shock on Patricia's face morphed into something else entirely. Her eyes darted from my simple, practical clothes to the massive cleaning bucket the landscapers had left near the hallway. A sudden twisted realization washed over her features. The shock melted away, and a wide, cruel, incredibly ugly smile spread across her face. Patricia threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh. The sound was harsh and mean, echoing brutally off the walls. "Oh my goodness," Patricia laughed, turning to look at Bradley. "Look at this. Would you just look at this?" For a second, I actually thought she had broken in. But she is working here. She is the hired help. Bradley let out a sharp bark of laughter, his massive ego instantly recovering. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Are you serious right now, Claire? You are scrubbing toilets for dead people. This is just pathetic. Even for you, this is a new low." "It makes perfect sense," Patricia said, her voice dripping with venomous joy. She walked a few steps closer to me, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of my supposed humiliation. 3 years ago, you came crying to our doorstep without a single dollar to your name. We threw you out because you were completely useless. I always knew you would end up at the very bottom of the barrel. And here you are, a glorified maid, dusting furniture in a house you could never, ever afford to step foot in otherwise. Tell me, Claire, do they let you sleep in the basement, or do you have to go back to a homeless shelter when your shift is over? I stood perfectly still. The sheer breathtaking magnitude of their delusion was almost hard to comprehend. They were so deeply blinded by their own arrogance, so completely convinced of their own superiority, that their brains simply fabricated a reality where I was a miserable servant just to make the situation make sense to them. They needed me to be a failure. Their entire worldview depended on me being a desperate, broken victim. I did not correct them. I did not scream that I owned the walls they were standing between. I just watched them dig their own graves deeper and deeper with every single word. Chloe stepped forward. She was a petite, overly groomed woman who wore too much perfume and looked at everyone as if they owed her money. She clearly enjoyed joining in on the cruelty. She walked past me, intentionally bumping her shoulder against my arm, and strolled over to a beautiful antique console table near the front door. She dragged her manicured finger across the pristine, polished wood. She held her finger up in the air, pretending to inspect it for dirt. She let out a dramatic, disappointed sigh and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile. "You missed a spot, Claire," Chloe sneered. "If you are going to be a maid, you should at least try to be a good one. Although I suppose we will have to fire you anyway. I really do not want my husband's deadbeat, bankrupt sister hanging around our new house. It is just a terrible look for us socially. People might think we actually associate with you." "Your new house," I repeated calmly, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. "That is exactly right," Bradley said, taking a heavy, aggressive step toward me. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me, just like he did when we were teenagers. He wanted me to shrink. He wanted me to cower. "My father-in-law, Richard, is Evelyn Hughes's only living relative. He inherits everything. Every single penny, every single property, and every single piece of furniture in this entire estate. He already told the lawyers to fast-track the probate paperwork. And because Chloe is his only daughter, he is gifting this entire property to us as a wedding present. We are the owners now, Claire." "Is that what Richard told you?" I asked mildly. "He told you the house belongs to him." "He does not have to tell us, you idiot. It is the law," Patricia snapped, losing her patience. She waved her hand dismissively in the air. "Richard is the sole heir. The woman is dead. Her assets passed to her nephew. It is incredibly simple, though I suppose someone who went completely bankrupt would not understand how real wealth actually works." I looked at Bradley. His face was flushed with the thrill of power. He truly believed he had won the ultimate prize. He believed he was standing in his new castle, and I was just a pest he needed to exterminate to claim his throne. He had spent his entire life taking whatever he wanted, and he was absolutely certain this moment was no different. Bradley stepped directly into my personal space. He stood so close I could smell the expensive, overpowering cologne he wore. He pointed a thick, aggressive finger directly at my chest. His eyes were cold hard and entirely devoid of any familial love. He was looking at me like I was an insect. "You were a beggar 3 years ago, Claire," Bradley said, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing growl. "You came crying to our house with nothing but garbage bags, and you were a pathetic beggar. And you will be homeless again today. I want you out of my house. Pack your rags, take your little cleaning bucket, and get off my property. You have exactly 24 hours. I watched Bradley stand there, with his finger practically touching my chest, waiting for me to break 3 years ago. Standing on that freezing driveway, I would have broken. I would have cried. I would have begged my mother for mercy. I would have tried to appeal to whatever tiny fraction of brotherly love I thought Bradley possessed, but I was no longer that desperate. Bankrupt, 28-year-old girl. I was a corporate auditor who had just spent the last 3 years untangling the darkest, most predatory financial webs human beings could weave. I knew exactly how to handle predators. You never fight them when they think they have the upper hand. You simply step back, let them overextend themselves, and watch them walk blindly into a trap of their own making. I looked at Bradley's flushed, arrogant face. I looked at Chloe, who was already running her hands over a priceless antique vase like she was pricing it for an estate sale. And then I looked at my mother, Patricia, who was watching me with a look of absolute, unadulterated triumph. She wanted a show. She wanted me to fall to my knees and weep over losing my supposed job as a maid. She wanted to relish the exquisite joy of throwing me out onto the street for a second time. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. I let my shoulders slump forward, just a fraction of an inch. I took a slow, shaky breath, carefully forcing my eyes to widen, as if I was desperately trying to process the crushing weight of their ultimate victory. I let my hands tremble slightly as I clasped them together in front of me. It was a performance, a perfectly calibrated display of absolute defeat, and they bought every single second of it. 24 hours, I said, making sure my voice sounded small and entirely broken. Bradley, please, you cannot just throw me out like this without any warning. I have nowhere else to go. The rental market is completely out of control right now. I just need a little more time to figure out my next move. That sounds like a personal problem, Claire, Patricia said smoothly. She took a step forward, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across her face. You have always been so terribly irresponsible with your life. We are not a charity. This is my daughter-in-law's new home, and we simply cannot have you squatting here. You have until tomorrow to pack up whatever cheap rags you brought with you. But there are protocols, I stammered, acting completely flustered. I looked back and forth between Bradley and Patricia, playing the role of the terrified, displaced worker. The security systems are highly complex. There are smart home access codes, exterior gate remotes, and a massive ring of master keys that control the main vaults and the conservatory. I cannot just drop them on the kitchen counter and walk away. I could be held legally liable if something goes missing, or if the property is not properly secured. Bradley rolled his eyes and let out a heavy, irritated sigh. You always make everything so ridiculously complicated, Claire. Just leave the keys on the table and get out. No, Bradley, wait, Chloe interrupted. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, her eyes gleaming with greed. She is actually right. Daddy said this house has a state-of-the-art security system. We need all the master codes. We need to make sure the staff entrances are locked, and we need to know how to override the perimeter alarms. We cannot just let her walk away without handing over the entire network. What if she tries to come back and steal something? Patricia nodded in firm agreement. Chloe is completely right. We need a formal handover. I want to see every single key and every single code written down before you are permitted to leave the premises. I looked down at the marble floor, playing the part of the thoroughly defeated sister. Fine, I whispered softly. I can prepare a full transition binder. I can gather all the master keys, the gate remotes, and the alarm documentation. But it will take me some time to get it all organized. Can we please just do this tomorrow evening? Say 7 o'clock. I will have everything waiting for you in the main living room. You can take the house. Just please give me until tomorrow night to gather my things. Patricia looked at Bradley silently, communicating her absolute delight. They were reveling in my submission. They were intoxicated by the sheer power they believed they held over my entire existence. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Bradley commanded, pointing his finger at me one last time. Do not try anything stupid, Claire. Have the keys on the table and your bags packed. If you are not walking out the door by 7:15, I am calling the police and having you physically dragged off my property. I understand, I said quietly. They turned around and walked out of the grand mahogany doors, completely satisfied with their spectacular victory. I watched through the large bay windows as they climbed back into their gleaming black Mercedes SUV. Patricia was actually laughing as Bradley put the car in reverse and sped down the winding gravel driveway. They were celebrating. They thought they had just conquered a $3 million estate and humiliated me in the process. The moment their taillights disappeared beyond the wrought iron gates, my trembling hands became perfectly still. My slumped shoulders straightened, and the mask of the terrified, defeated sister completely melted away. The quiet, peaceful silence of Evelyn's house settled back into the grand foyer, but the air felt entirely different now. It felt charged with a sharp, undeniable electricity. I walked methodically into the library and sat down at the heavy mahogany desk. I opened my laptop and pulled up my personal contact directory. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel any sadness. I only felt a cold, relentless drive to execute the final phase of a perfectly designed plan. I picked up the telephone and dialed the direct line of my estate attorney, Mr. Harrison answered on the first ring. His voice was deep, authoritative, and entirely unflappable. Claire, he said, to what do I owe the pleasure this afternoon? They took the bait, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. My brother, his wife, and my mother just trespassed into the main foyer. Richard clearly sent them here to claim the property. They told me I have exactly 24 hours to pack my bags and vacate the premises. I heard the faint scratching of a pen on paper over the phone line. Mr. Harrison did not sound even slightly surprised. He sounded like a chess grandmaster who had just watched his opponent move their queen directly into a fatal trap. And what did you tell them? Mr. Harrison asked smoothly. I told them to come back tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock for a formal handover of the keys and the security codes, I replied. They are bringing Richard's fraudulent 2018 will. They plan to use it to intimidate me into leaving. I need you here at 6:45. Bring the irrevocable trust documents. Bring the finalized deed. Bring everything. I will be there, Mr. Harrison said. His tone carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute legal destruction. We will show them exactly who owns that estate. I hung up the phone, but my work was not even close to finished. Defeating my family in an empty room was not enough. When my mother threw me out into the rain 3 years ago, she made sure the neighbors saw it. She had loudly called me a failure, intentionally making a brutal public spectacle of my bankruptcy and my grief. She wanted an audience for my destruction. I was simply going to return the favor. I scrolled through the community directory I had saved when I first moved into the neighborhood. I found the phone number for Robert, the president of the local homeowners association. Robert was a wealthy retired investment banker who prided himself on maintaining the strict security and pristine reputation of our gated community. I dialed his number. Robert, this is Claire Sterling, over at the Hughes estate, I said politely when he answered. I apologize for the late notice, but I am hosting a very small private gathering tomorrow evening to discuss some neighborhood security concerns. We have had some issues with unauthorized individuals attempting to access the private roads. I would be honored if you could join me for coffee and dessert at 6:45. Robert was immediately interested. Nothing captured the attention of an HOA president quite like the phrase unauthorized individuals. He agreed to attend without a second of hesitation. Next, I dialed the non-emergency line for the local police precinct. I specifically asked to speak with Sergeant Miller, the community liaison officer who oversaw the patrol routes for our district. I introduced myself as the sole trustee and legal homeowner of the Hughes estate. I told the sergeant that I was executing a highly sensitive transition of property access the following evening. I explained that there had been some extremely aggressive behavior from distant relatives of the former owner, and I simply wanted a completely neutral, authoritative presence on site to ensure the peace was kept during the transition. I offered him fresh coffee and pastries, asking him to arrive at 6:45 to briefly review the legal documents before the relatives arrived. Sergeant Miller, recognizing the high-profile address and appreciating the proactive approach, readily agreed to park his cruiser in the driveway and sit in the living room during the exchange. The trap was now perfectly, beautifully set. I spent the rest of the evening preparing the house. I polished the grand dining table. I set out delicate porcelain cups and silver spoons. I prepared a pot of expensive artisan coffee and arranged a beautiful selection of pastries on a silver platter. I wanted the living room to look incredibly civilized, utterly sophisticated, and completely under my control. I slept better that night than I had in 3 long years. The next day passed with a slow, agonizing tension. I went about my normal routine, reviewing financial portfolios and responding to client emails, but my mind was entirely focused on the evening to come. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns, I changed into a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. I pulled my hair back into a severe professional style. I did not look like a scared 28-year-old girl, and I certainly did not look like a maid. I looked like a woman who held the keys to a financial empire. At exactly 6:45, the doorbell chimed. I opened the door to find Mr. Harrison standing on the porch, holding a thick premium leather briefcase. Robert, the HOA president, arrived moments later, dressed in a casual blazer and looking eager to discuss neighborhood protocol. Right behind him, Sergeant Miller pulled his official police cruiser into the circular driveway, the prominent blue and white decals highly visible under the porch lights. I welcomed them all, inside offering them coffee and directing them to the plush seating arrangement in the center of the grand living room. I sat down in the high-backed armchair, directly facing the foyer. I briefly explained to Robert and Sergeant Miller that we were expecting a few highly aggressive individuals who falsely believed they had a legal claim to my home. Mr. Harrison sat silently beside me, his briefcase resting on the coffee table, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying legal authority. The atmosphere in the room was calm, polite, and completely heavily fortified. We sipped our coffee and engaged in light, pleasant conversation about the upcoming autumn weather and local property values. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked with a slow, steady rhythm. Every single second that passed brought my family closer to the absolute total annihilation of their entire greedy universe. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy crunch of tires on gravel echoed loudly through the open front windows. I placed my porcelain coffee cup gently onto the matching saucer. I looked out the window and saw the black Mercedes SUV swerve violently into the driveway, coming to a halt directly behind Sergeant Miller's marked police cruiser. I watched the doors swing open. I watched Patricia, Bradley, Chloe, and Richard step out onto the pavement. I watched their confident, arrogant strides as they marched toward my front porch, completely convinced they were about to throw me out into the street. The heavy brass doorbell rang a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the quiet elegance of the living room. I slowly stood up from my armchair. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, took a deep, steadying breath, and straightened my posture perfectly. The slaughter was about to begin. The heavy brass doorbell did not just ring. It was pressed down hard and held there by someone demanding immediate and absolute entry. Before I could even take a single step toward the foyer, the heavy mahogany front doors were pushed violently open. A rush of crisp autumn wind swept into the warm, quiet elegance of my living room. They did not bother to close the doors behind them. They intentionally left them standing wide open to the twilight air, making absolutely certain that any passing neighbor or evening dog walker would have a perfectly clear view of the spectacle they were about to create. Bradley strutted into the house first. He wore a sharp designer suit and a smirk so profound it looked permanently painted onto his face. Chloe followed right on his heels, her high heels clicking aggressively against the imported marble tiles. She carried a massive designer handbag and looked around the grand foyer with the hungry, entitled eyes of a vulture inspecting a fresh carcass. Then came Richard. He walked with the slow, heavy arrogance of a man who firmly believed his wealth made him completely untouchable in any situation. Finally, my mother, Patricia, stepped through the grand entryway. She was flanked by a man I had never seen before, a man wearing a cheap, shiny suit and carrying a battered leather briefcase. He had the distinct, greasy look of a private attorney who specialized in bullying vulnerable people. They walked directly into the center of the grand foyer, their loud, chaotic energy completely shattering the peaceful atmosphere I had carefully cultivated. They fully expected to find me completely alone. They expected to corner a terrified, isolated 28-year-old girl frantically packing her meager belongings into a cheap canvas duffel bag. Instead, they stopped dead in their tracks when they looked past the grand staircase and saw the living room. I was standing perfectly straight beside my high-backed armchair. Mr. Harrison sat calmly on the plush sofa, his pristine leather briefcase resting neatly on the antique coffee table. Robert, the president of the Homeowners Association, sat across from him, holding a delicate porcelain teacup. And standing quietly near the fireplace, sipping coffee from a paper cup, was Sergeant Miller, in his full official police uniform. For a fraction of a second, absolute confusion washed over the faces of my family members. Bradley stopped his aggressive march forward. Richard frowned deeply, his eyes darting suspiciously toward the police uniform. But Patricia, completely blinded by her own towering narcissism, immediately misinterpreted the entire scene. She saw the police officer. She saw the older, respectable-looking neighbor. And her twisted, cruel mind instantly concluded that these men were here to deal with a squatter. She believed they had arrived to help her throw me out. A wide, triumphant smile spread across my mother's face. She actually clapped her hands together in sheer delight. She stepped forward, ignoring me completely, and addressed Robert and Sergeant Miller with a loud theatrical voice specifically designed to echo all the way out into the driveway. "Oh, gentlemen, please do not mind us," Patricia announced, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "I see you have already discovered our little pest problem. We are just here to finalize the eviction of my deadbeat daughter. I apologize if she has caused any trouble in your beautiful neighborhood. We actually had to throw her out of our own home 3 years ago when she went completely bankrupt. She drained her bank accounts, ruined her credit, and expected us to foot the bill for her spectacular failures. Clearly, she has not learned her lesson about respecting other people's property." Patricia walked further into the room, absolutely relishing the attention. She looked at Robert masterfully, performing the role of the exhausted, deeply embarrassed mother. "You can only imagine the absolute nightmare it has been for our family." She continued, her voice dripping with fake, manufactured sympathy. "We tried to raise her right, but some people are just born parasites. She manipulated her way into this house to work as a lowly maid for the poor woman who recently passed away, and now she is trying to squat here like a common criminal. We are here to throw her out onto the street where she belongs. It is a harsh lesson, but it is truly the only way she will ever learn." Chloe snorted loudly from the foyer, eager to join the public character assassination. "It is honestly just pathetic," Chloe said, dramatically examining her manicured fingernails. "She does not have a single dollar to her name, and she actually thought she could hide in a $3 million estate. My father owns this house now. We are moving in by the end of the month, and we will definitely be fumigating whatever room she was sleeping in." I stood perfectly still and listened to every single word they said. I felt the familiar toxic sting of my mother's cruelty wash over me. I remembered standing in the freezing Portland rain 3 years ago, shaking uncontrollably as these exact same people called me a failure and locked me out in the dark. On that terrible night, their words had absolutely destroyed me. They had crushed my spirit and left me feeling completely worthless. I had spent countless sleepless nights shedding bitter tears over the mother who refused to love me and the brother who treated me like garbage. But tonight, standing in the warm golden light of my own grand living room, surrounded by people who knew the absolute truth, I felt absolutely no pain. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the desperate need to defend myself, to scream, or to beg for their understanding. Instead, I felt a deep, profound, and incredibly cold satisfaction. It was the exact kind of satisfaction that settles into your bones when you are holding the ultimate winning hand in a high-stakes game and your arrogant opponents are gleefully pushing all their chips into the center of the table. I glanced slightly at Mr. Harrison. He was watching Patricia with an expression of mild, clinical disgust. Robert, the Homeowners Association president, slowly lowered his teacup, staring at my mother as if she had just completely lost her mind. Sergeant Miller remained perfectly quiet, his hands resting on his heavy duty belt, observing the aggressive intruders with a hard professional stare. They knew exactly who I was. They had read the legal documents. They knew I was the sole owner of this massive estate, a brilliant corporate auditor, and a woman of profound integrity. Patricia's vicious lies were not humiliating me. They were entirely destroying her own credibility in front of the very people she was trying so desperately to impress. Richard finally stepped past Patricia, apparently deciding it was time to take formal charge of the situation. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and shot a dark, highly threatening glare in my direction. He wanted to assert his absolute dominance. He wanted to make it undeniably clear that he was the patriarch, the man who controlled the wealth, and the man who was about to end my miserable existence. Richard gestured to the man in the cheap suit standing beside him. "This has gone on long enough." Richard barked, his voice laced with heavy, unfiltered impatience. "We are not here to chat with the local neighbors. We are here to execute a legal transition of property. This is my private attorney, Mr. Vance." The sleazy attorney stepped forward. He did not bother to introduce himself to the police officer or the Homeowners Association president. He walked directly toward the antique coffee table, his eyes locked onto me with a predatory, bullying glare. He clearly specialized in intimidating people who did not have the financial resources to fight back. He unlatched his battered leather briefcase with a loud, aggressive snap. He reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder. He raised the folder high in the air and slammed it down onto the polished wood of the coffee table with as much force as he could muster. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a physical blow. He leaned heavily over the table, pressing his knuckles into the wood, trying to physically dominate the space between us. "This is the 2018 last will and testament of Evelyn Hughes." The attorney sneered, his voice loud, grating, and incredibly aggressive. "This legally binding document clearly states that Richard is the sole and exclusive heir to her entire estate. Every single asset, including the ground you are currently standing on, belongs entirely to him. Now, you are going to hand over the keys and the security codes, right? This second little girl. Or we are going to press criminal trespassing charges and have this officer drag you out of here in handcuffs." The echo of Mr. Vance, slamming his manila folder onto my antique coffee table, hung heavily in the quiet air of the grand living room. He stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, completely enamored with his own aggressive performance. He genuinely believed he had just delivered the ultimate killing blow to a helpless victim. He thought he was dealing with a frightened, desperate 28-year-old girl who would crumble to pieces at the mere mention of the police or criminal trespassing charges. He expected me to start crying. He expected me to drop to my knees, beg for mercy, and hand over the keys to the $3 million estate without a single question or objection. My mother, Patricia, wore a smile so wide and victorious, it looked physically painful. She was practically vibrating with malicious, unearned joy. Bradley stood right beside her, crossing his arms over his expensive designer shirt and looking down at me with the exact same look of pure, unfiltered disgust he had given me 3 years ago on that freezing, rain-soaked driveway. Chloe was already looking past me, entirely dismissing my presence as she stared up at the crystal chandelier, clearly calculating how much money she could get for it at an estate auction. They were entirely ready for my total, humiliating surrender. Instead, I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I kept my hands folded perfectly in my lap and maintained a steady, completely emotionless gaze. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their toxic, frantic energy to fall completely flat against the calm, heavily fortified atmosphere of my living room. Robert, the Homeowners Association president, calmly took another slow sip of his coffee, his eyes tracking my mother with deep disapproval. Sergeant Miller simply shifted his weight, his hands resting naturally on his utility belt. He was watching Mr. Vance with the incredibly dull, unimpressed expression of a veteran police officer who deals with loud, cheap bullies on a daily basis. Then the heavy, solid oak door of the adjacent library opened with a smooth, quiet click. Mr. Harrison stepped out into the living room. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered grace of a man who held the absolute highest echelon of legal authority in the entire state. He slowly buttoned his bespoke tailored suit jacket as he walked his polished leather shoes, making virtually no sound on the imported Persian rugs. Mr. Harrison was not a man who ever needed to shout to command a room. I was a senior partner at a firm that handled the private estates of billionaires, tech moguls, and generational corporate dynasties. He possessed an aura of such profound, crushing competence that the entire temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees the exact moment he entered the space. Mr. Vance turned his head toward the sound of the opening door. I watched his face incredibly closely as his eyes locked onto Mr. Harrison. The psychological transformation was absolutely spectacular. It happened in the span of 3 short seconds. The smug, bullying smirk that had been plastered aggressively across Mr. Vance's face instantly vanished without a trace. His aggressive, dominating posture completely collapsed, his shoulders slumping forward defensively. The color rapidly drained from his greasy cheeks, leaving him looking like a foolish man who had just brought a plastic butter knife to a heavily armed military standoff. He recognized Mr. Harrison immediately. Every single attorney in the city knew exactly who Arthur Harrison was, and they all knew you absolutely never, ever wanted to find yourself sitting on the opposing side of his negotiation table. Mr. Harrison walked slowly toward the center of the room. He completely ignored Patricia, Richard, Chloe, and Bradley. To him, they were nothing more than background noise, temporary irritants that simply needed to be swatted away. He walked directly up to the coffee table and stopped right in front of the sweating, panicked private attorney. "I believe you are currently threatening my client in her own home," Mr. Harrison said. His voice was quiet, incredibly polite, and utterly terrifying. Mr. Vance actually swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously in his throat. He looked down at the manila folder he had just slammed so proudly onto the table, suddenly looking as if he fervently wished it would burst into flames and disappear forever. "Mr. Harrison," he stammered, his loud, abrasive tone completely gone, replaced by a high-pitched, fearful squeak. "I was not informed that your prestigious firm was representing the opposition in this matter. I am simply executing the lawful wishes of my client Richard, who is the sole named heir in the 2018 last will and testament of Evelyn Hughes. We are just here to claim the property." Mr. Harrison reached down and picked up the manila folder. He did not open it. He did not read a single page of their supposedly ironclad document. He held it between his thumb and forefinger like it was a piece of contaminated, disgusting trash, completely dismissing the very document that Richard and my family had banked their entire financial future on. "A standard will is subject to the probate court system," Mr. Harrison said smoothly, dropping the folder back onto the table with a negligent flick of his wrist. His eyes bypassed the sleazy attorney and locked directly onto Richard now. "A standard will can be contested, delayed, and endlessly argued over by greedy, estranged relatives who feel they are somehow entitled to unearned wealth." Evelyn Hughes was a highly intelligent, remarkably perceptive woman. She knew exactly what kind of financial predators were aggressively circling her estate in her final months. She knew that a standard will would not be sufficient to protect her legacy or her chosen daughter from your particular brand of relentless financial harassment. Richard took a slow, unsteady step backward. The sheer towering arrogance that had carried him into my home just moments ago was beginning to visibly and rapidly fracture. Patricia looked frantically between Richard, Mr. Vance, and Mr. Harrison, her mind desperately trying to comprehend why her perfect, flawless plan to ruin my life was suddenly stalling out. Bradley's face flushed with deep, angry red color as he realized the powerful tide in the room was rapidly turning violently against them. Mr. Harrison reached calmly into his pristine leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, professionally bound, heavily notarized legal document. It was securely sealed in a premium blue jacket, bearing the embossed, intimidating logo of his incredibly prestigious law firm. He held it up slightly, so the overhead chandelier lights caught the shimmering gold notary seals stamped firmly onto the front page. This property, along with all associated liquid assets, is no longer subject to the probate process in any capacity, Mr. Harrison announced. His voice carried the heavy, absolute finality of a Supreme Court judge, delivering a massive, unappealable sentence. In fact, Evelyn Hughes did not technically own this estate as an individual at the time of her passing. Neither did she personally own the 12 high-yield investment accounts, the massive liquid cash reserves, or the priceless antique contents of this physical house. Therefore, none of these items can be inherited through any last will and testament, regardless of what year your useless document was signed. That is legally impossible, Richard choked out. His voice sounded remarkably thin, shaky, and highly desperate. I am her nephew. I am her only living blood relative. Everything she had automatically belongs to me. The law protects blood relatives. You are incredibly and dangerously mistaken, Mr. Harrison corrected him, his tone sharp and completely unforgiving. 2 full months before her death, while she was of entirely sound mind and body, Evelyn Hughes legally transferred the absolute entirety of her wealth, her real estate portfolio, and her liquid assets into a fully funded, properly executed, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a permanent legal entity that completely bypasses probate. It cannot be legally altered, it cannot be frozen by a court, and it absolutely cannot be claimed by distant, abusive relatives trying to cash in on a tragedy. Mr. Harrison turned his sharp gaze across the room, purposely ensuring that Robert, the HOA president, and Sergeant Miller were paying incredibly close attention to his next deeply important words. The sole appointed trustee and the sole exclusive beneficiary of the Evelyn Hughes Irrevocable Trust is sitting right in front of you, Mr. Harrison stated loudly and clearly, gesturing his hand politely toward my armchair. Her name is Claire Sterling. She is the absolute, undisputed legal owner of this $3 million estate, and you are all currently standing in her private foyer, completely uninvited. The reaction in the room was immediate, visceral, and absolutely chaotic. The color completely and utterly drained from Richard's face. He looked as though he had just been physically struck in the stomach by a heavy, blunt object. He stumbled backward, his polished shoes slipping on the marble floor, bumping hard into Chloe. Chloe let out a sharp, high-pitched gasp of pure, unfiltered panic. Her wide eyes darted wildly around the room, staring at the priceless chandeliers, the expensive Persian rugs, and the antique furniture, realizing in real time that she was never going to live in this magnificent house. The massive, unearned wealth she had been greedily planning to spend for months was completely gone, locked securely away behind an impenetrable legal wall that her father could not break down. Patricia gaped at me like a fish pulled violently out of water. Her jaw went completely slack. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. The psychological shock was completely short-circuiting her brain. She had spent the last 3 entire years fully convincing herself that I was a worthless, bankrupt failure who deserved to suffer. She had built her entire maternal identity and social superiority complex around being immensely better than the deeply flawed daughter she had so callously thrown out into the freezing rain. Looking at me right now, sitting comfortably in an expensive tailored suit in my own multi-million-dollar mansion, completely and violently shattered her false reality. She reached out and grabbed the edge of a nearby antique console table with trembling hands, just to keep herself from physically collapsing onto the floor in a dead faint. Bradley, however, did not freeze in shock. Bradley possessed the exact same toxic, highly aggressive entitlement as his mother. But he entirely lacked her ability to accurately read a room. He had spent his entire privileged life taking whatever he wanted by sheer brute force and loud intimidation. His brain simply could not process the concept of being legally, thoroughly defeated by the younger sister he viewed as human garbage. With a loud, guttural yell of pure, unadulterated frustration, Bradley lunged forward. He shoved aggressively past his wife and Mr. Vance, reaching out violently toward Mr. Harrison. He was attempting to physically snatch the bound trust documents right out of the senior attorney's hands. He was acting like a wild, undisciplined animal throwing a deeply embarrassing temper tantrum. Mr. Harrison did not flinch, nor did he panic. He smoothly stepped back, easily pulling the valuable documents entirely out of Bradley's reach, while simultaneously positioning his own body directly between my aggressive brother and my armchair. It was a subtle, highly protective movement that spoke volumes about his absolute control of the volatile situation. At the exact same moment, Sergeant Miller stepped swiftly forward from his quiet position near the stone fireplace. The sound of his heavy-duty police boots hitting the marble floor was sharp, loud, and incredibly commanding. He dropped his right hand directly onto his leather duty belt, resting his palm right next to his official radio and his heavy steel handcuffs. He did not draw a weapon, but the physical threat of immediate forceful law enforcement intervention was completely undeniable to everyone in the room. "Step back right now, sir," Sergeant Miller ordered, his voice echoing through the grand foyer with deep, practiced, and unyielding authority. "Keep your hands entirely to yourself and step back from the homeowner and her legal counsel right this second, or you will be leaving this property tonight in the back of my cruiser." Bradley froze in his tracks, his chest heaving with heavy, angry breaths. He looked at the stern, unblinking police officer, then at the towering, completely unbothered presence of Mr. Harrison, and finally his furious, bloodshot eyes locked onto me. His face was twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of absolute, unhinged rage. The thick veins in his neck were visibly bulging against his designer collar. He had lost. He knew in his dark, greedy heart that he had lost the house, the money, and the power. The sheer crushing humiliation of losing it all to the very sister he had so gleefully discarded in the mud was driving him entirely out of his mind. "This is massive fraud!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with intense desperation and raw fury. He pointed his shaking finger directly at my face, ignoring the police officer's warning completely. "You manipulated a sick, dying old woman. You isolated her and brainwashed her into signing over her money when she did not know what she was doing. You are a disgusting, thieving criminal, Claire, but you will not get away with this. I swear to you, we are going to hire a real legal team. We are going to drag you through civil court for years. We will freeze every single penny of that trust, and we are going to sue you until you are absolutely bankrupt again." I remained perfectly seated in my comfortable armchair. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of fear, stress, or intimidation. I looked directly into the eyes of the brother who had thrown my clothes into the puddles, and I let a slow, terrifying, deeply predatory smile spread across my face. "I was hoping you would say that, Bradley," I replied softly. I watched Bradley stand there, with his finger practically touching my chest, waiting for me to break 3 years ago. Standing on that freezing driveway, I would have broken. I would have cried. I would have begged my mother for mercy. I would have tried to appeal to whatever tiny fraction of brotherly love I thought Bradley possessed, but I was no longer that desperate. Bankrupt, 28-year-old girl. I was a corporate auditor who had just spent the last 3 years untangling the darkest, most predatory financial webs human beings could weave. I knew exactly how to handle predators. You never fight them when they think they have the upper hand. You simply step back, let them overextend themselves, and watch them walk blindly into a trap of their own making. For 28 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been the punching bag. I had been the repository for all of their insecurities and their failures. When my father was dying, I was the one who sat by his bedside while Patricia and Bradley took luxury vacations. I was the one who scrubbed the floors, paid the bills, and kept the lights on until they decided I was no longer useful and threw my belongings onto a freezing driveway in the middle of the night. They had trained me to be small. They had conditioned me to look down at my shoes, to apologize for breathing the same air as them, to accept their cruelty as if it were a natural law of the universe. But standing in that grand, beautifully lit foyer, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my own competence, that terrified girl was completely dead and gone. I did not shrink away from Bradley's pointing finger. I did not lower my eyes. I stepped forward. I closed the distance between us, forcing him to take a sudden, involuntary step backward. I walked past him with slow, deliberate steps. I moved toward the massive antique coffee table sitting in the center of the living room. Mr. Harrison watched me with a look of calm, professional approval. Robert, the Homeowners Association president, sat perfectly still, completely captivated by the unfolding drama. Sergeant Miller rested his hand near his duty belt, a silent guardian, ensuring that my physical safety was absolutely guaranteed. I reached down and picked up a thick, heavy ledger bound in dark blue leather. It was not just a book. It was the culmination of weeks of relentless, agonizing work. It was the physical manifestation of 80-hour work weeks of staring at dual monitors until my vision blurred of tracking every single stolen penny through a labyrinth of corporate deceit. I held the heavy ledger in both of my hands, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the truth. I turned around to face the people who had tried to destroy me. "Before you file that lawsuit, Bradley," I said. My voice was not loud, but it echoed clearly through the absolute silence of the grand living room. "Before you go crying to a civil court judge, and before you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to sue me into bankruptcy, you might want to consult your own accountant." I let the words hang in the air for a fraction of a second. I looked directly into my brother's eyes. "Oh, wait," I said, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. "You cannot do that, because as a fully licensed corporate auditor, I have already reviewed your books." The color completely drained from Bradley's face. He looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of his lungs. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. Patricia blinked rapidly, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. She did not understand what was happening. She still believed I was just a maid, a pathetic loser who scrubbed toilets for a living. The concept that I was a financial professional dismantling their entire lives was entirely beyond her limited comprehension. Richard, however, understood immediately. He was a businessman, albeit a corrupt and predatory one. He recognized the specific terminology. He recognized the heavy blue ledger in my hands. A dark, sickly shade of gray crept up his neck. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming authority. "You have no right to look at any financial documents. You are a nobody." I opened the heavy blue ledger. The sound of the thick parchment pages turning was the only noise in the room. I did not look at Richard. I looked directly at the detailed spreadsheet I had printed and bound. "Apex Heritage Construction," I announced, clearly reading the name off the top of the page. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine gasp. Her manicured hands flew up to cover her mouth. Her massive designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the marble floor with a loud, heavy thud. She knew that name. She knew exactly what that company was. A commercial contracting firm registered in the state of Oregon. I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "The primary registered agent is Bradley Sterling. The primary financial beneficiary is Chloe Sterling. It is a very impressive sounding company. It sounds incredibly legitimate. There is just one tiny, unavoidable problem. Apex Heritage Construction does not actually employ a single construction worker. It does not own a single piece of heavy machinery. It does not hold a single active building permit in the entire county. It is nothing but a hollow shell." I looked up from the ledger and locked my eyes onto Richard. He was physically trembling now. "It is a phantom corporation created for one singular purpose," I said softly. "To launder money." "Shut up," Richard hissed, taking a frantic step forward. "You shut your mouth right now." Sergeant Miller immediately took one single heavy step forward from the fireplace. He did not say a word, but his imposing physical presence caused Richard to freeze instantly in his tracks. Richard swallowed hard and stepped back, his chest heaving with trapped, impotent rage. "Let us review the invoices, shall we?" I said, looking back down at my meticulously organized ledger. I turned to the next page. On November 14th, 2022, a wire transfer was initiated from Evelyn Hughes's primary high-yield savings account. The amount was exactly $22,500. The attached invoice claimed this money was for a complete overhaul of the estate's rear conservatory roof. But as we all know, the conservatory roof was leaking so badly last winter that Evelyn had to put plastic buckets on the floor just to catch the freezing rain. No work was ever done. I turned another page, the crisp sound cutting through the heavy silence. On April 3rd, 2023, I recited a wire transfer of $18,900 was sent to Apex Heritage Construction. The invoice stated this was for premium landscape restoration and emergency plumbing services. Yet when I arrived here, the antique rose gardens were completely dead-choked by massive weeds, and the boiler in the basement was barely functioning. Evelyn was sitting in the freezing house wrapped in heavy wool blankets, shivering while you siphoned her life savings directly into your own pockets. Patricia was staring at Bradley with wide, horrified eyes. For the first time in her entire life, the perfect golden illusion she had constructed around her favorite child was beginning to crack. "Bradley," she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine shock. "What is she talking about? What did you do?" Bradley could not even look at our mother. He was staring at the floor, his face pale and slick with a sudden cold sweat. His arrogant, bullying posture had completely vanished. He looked exactly like the terrified, cowardly little boy he had always truly been underneath his expensive clothes and loud voice. "You used your position as her financial proxy to authorize the payments, Richard," I said, speaking with the cold, clinical precision of an expert witness testifying in a federal court. "And Bradley provided the fake invoices to make the massive withdrawals appear legitimate to the bank's fraud detection algorithms. You systematically bled an elderly, highly vulnerable woman dry. You stole the money she spent her entire life earning. You took her security, you took her dignity, and you used her wealth to fund your luxury cars, your designer clothes, and your European vacations." I closed the heavy blue ledger with a loud, definitive snap. "That is a textbook example of elder financial abuse," I stated clearly. "It is also a textbook example of corporate wire fraud, banking fraud, and grand larceny. But interestingly enough, those are not actually your biggest problems right now." Richard stared at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. He looked like a man standing on the train tracks, watching the blinding headlights of an approaching locomotive. "What do you mean?" Richard breathed, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "I am a corporate tax auditor," I reminded them smoothly. "I trace the flow of money, and when you steal hundreds of thousands of dollars through a fake shell corporation, you create a massive, undeniable trail of digital evidence. The problem with stealing that much money, Bradley, is that you did not declare a single penny of it as legitimate income on your federal tax returns. You routed the stolen cash into offshore holding accounts and private luxury expenditures to hide it from the government." I looked at the sleazy private attorney, Mr. Vance. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes darting frantically between me, Mr. Harrison, and his clients. He was rapidly performing a very terrifying mental calculus. "You see," I continued, making sure every single person in the room heard me perfectly. 3 weeks ago, I compiled every single forged invoice. I documented every single unauthorized wire transfer. I printed out the complete banking history of Apex Heritage Construction, and I matched those deposits directly to your personal spending records. I put all of this undeniable, hard evidence into a highly detailed, comprehensive digital file. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute destruction of the monsters who had tortured me for years. "I did not just keep this ledger for myself," I said. "I formally submitted a comprehensive whistleblower report directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I filed Form 211. The federal authorities already have everything. They have the routing numbers. They have the fake invoices. They have the dates, the times, and the exact dollar amounts." A collective gasp of pure, unfiltered terror swept through my family. Chloe literally collapsed onto her knees right there on the marble floor of the foyer, sobbing hysterically and ruining her expensive designer dress. She realized instantly that her entire life of luxury was completely over. She was not going to be a wealthy socialite living in a grand mansion. She was going to be the wife of a convicted federal felon. Bradley stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the front door frame to keep himself from falling over. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. The realization of federal prison time was crashing down on him with the crushing weight of a falling building. Patricia covered her face with both of her hands, letting out a long, high-pitched wail of absolute despair. The golden child she had worshipped her entire life was a massive predatory criminal, and her discarded, useless daughter was the one holding the axe over his neck. Her perfect, carefully curated social reputation was about to be completely obliterated in the most public, humiliating way possible. Federal mandatory minimums for corporate tax evasion and wire fraud are incredibly severe, Mr. Harrison added smoothly, from the sofa, twisting the knife with masterful legal precision. Especially when the crimes involve the systematic financial abuse of a vulnerable elderly victim. The IRS does not negotiate with individuals who steal from the dying. They seize assets, they freeze accounts, and they prosecute to the fullest extent of the federal law. The sleazy private attorney, Mr. Vance, suddenly moved. He had walked into my home acting like a swaggering, untouchable heavyweight champion. He had slammed his useless folder onto my coffee table and threatened to have me arrested. But Mr. Vance was not a fool. He was a bottom-feeding opportunist, and bottom-feeders know exactly when the ship is sinking. He realized in one terrifying, blinding flash of clarity that his clients had just essentially confessed to multiple massive federal crimes in a room fully occupied by an elite corporate attorney, an HOA president, and a uniformed police officer. If he stayed in this room for one more minute, if he attempted to defend them or represent them in any capacity regarding this stolen estate, he would instantly become an accessory after the fact to a massive federal money laundering operation. He would lose his license, his livelihood, and quite possibly his own freedom. Mr. Vance did not say a single word of farewell. He did not offer his clients a single word of legal counsel or comfort. He lunged forward with frantic, uncoordinated movements. He grabbed his manila folder off the coffee table, shoving it violently back into his battered leather briefcase. He snapped the heavy brass locks shut with shaking, sweaty hands. He turned around and practically sprinted toward the open front doors. He pushed past a sobbing Chloe. He shoved his shoulder hard past a stunned, paralyzed Bradley. He ran out onto the front porch, his cheap shoes slapping loudly against the pavement as he fled toward his vehicle. He literally abandoned his wealthy, arrogant clients in the middle of my foyer, running away as fast as his legs could possibly carry him. The heavy mahogany front doors had barely clicked shut behind the fleeing, panicked private attorney before the absolute reality of the situation crashed over the remaining intruders. The loud, arrogant energy that my family had carried into my home just minutes ago evaporated entirely. It was replaced by a thick, suffocating atmosphere of pure dread. I stood perfectly still near my comfortable armchair, watching the magnificent, instantaneous destruction of their false reality. They were no longer the victorious, wealthy conquerors stepping into their newly inherited castle. They were cornered, desperate animals trapped in a highly secured room with a trained corporate auditor, a seasoned estate attorney, the president of the local homeowners association, and a fully uniformed police officer. They had walked willingly into a beautifully constructed cage with their heads held high, and I had just locked the door securely from the outside. Richard was the very first person to break the heavy silence. His face, which had previously been flushed with power and aggressive authority, was now a sickly, pale shade of gray. He turned his head slowly, locking his wide, bloodshot eyes onto my brother. The transformation in Richard was terrifying to witness. The polished, wealthy businessman completely disappeared, revealing the vicious, desperate predator hiding underneath the expensive suit. He took a sudden, violent step toward Bradley. He raised his hands, his fingers curling into tight, shaking fists. He looked like he wanted to physically attack my brother right there on the imported marble floor. "You promised me the financial trails were entirely clean." Richard screamed, his voice shattering the quiet elegance of the foyer. The sound was raw and guttural. "You looked me right in the eye and told me that your shell company was completely untraceable. You said you had encrypted the accounts and buried the wire transfers deeply under layers of legitimate-looking contractor expenses. You'd have told me nobody would ever be able to connect Apex Heritage Construction back to us or to any of our personal accounts. Bradley stumbled backward, his expensive designer shoes slipping clumsily on the polished stone tiles. He held his hands up in a frantic defensive gesture. The arrogant, bullying older brother who had just threatened to throw me out into the street was completely gone. He was practically cowering, his eyes wide with blind, consuming panic. "I did clean the trails," Bradley stammered, his voice pitching upward into a desperate, reedy whine. "I used encrypted servers. I routed the payments through 3 different dummy accounts before they ever hit my personal holdings. I paid an offshore consultant thousands of dollars to set up the corporate structure exactly the way you asked me to. She should not have been able to find this information." "It is completely impossible. She is just a low-level accountant. She is bluffing Richard. She has to be bluffing right now. She does not have any real proof." I did not interrupt them. I simply stood there and let them expose themselves even further. Every single word they screamed at each other in their panic was a verbal confession freely offered in front of reliable, unimpeachable witnesses. Chloe, who had been standing frozen near the console table, suddenly snapped her head up. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, and the reality of what Bradley and her father had just admitted out loud finally pierced through her superficial status-obsessed brain. She realized in a horrifying flash that her brand new Mercedes, her designer clothes, and her luxurious European vacations were not the result of her husband working hard as a brilliant commercial contractor. They were the direct result of federal wire fraud and the systematic, cruel financial abuse of her own dying great-aunt. More importantly, she realized that the money was entirely gone, and the federal government was coming to collect everything she owned. Chloe scrambled forward, her high heels scraping harshly against the floor. She lunged at Bradley, her hands curled into angry claws. She shoved him hard in the chest, pushing him back against the heavy wooden console table. "You lied to me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high-vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "You told me you were a highly successful commercial contractor. You told me you had massive corporate clients and millions of dollars in legitimate taxable revenue. You promised me a life of extreme luxury. You promised me we would live in this massive estate. And now you are telling me that every single thing we own was stolen from my great-aunt. You are a disgusting criminal, Bradley. You are going to federal prison for a very long time. They are going to seize our bank accounts. They are going to take the cars. They are going to take my jewelry and my designer bags. I am not going to be the miserable wife of a convicted felon. I am not going to lose my entire social standing because you were too stupid and too careless to cover your illegal tracks. You have completely ruined my life." Bradley tried to grab her wrists, desperately attempting to calm her down, but she slapped his hands away with violent, unhidden disgust. She turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward her father, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But Richard was completely ignoring her. He was too busy pacing like a caged tiger near the front door, muttering frantically under his breath about asset protection strategies and offshore banking accounts. The alliance of pure greed that had brought them all together was violently tearing itself apart right in the middle of my beautiful foyer. And then there was my mother. Patricia had been standing near the doorway, completely paralyzed by the unfolding disaster. She had watched her wealthy, powerful son-in-law crumble into a desperate, panicked mess. She had watched her beautiful status symbol daughter-in-law turn into a hysterical, screaming liability. But most devastatingly of all, she had watched the absolute golden child, her precious, perfect son Bradley, be exposed to the entire room as a cowardly, incompetent criminal who was staring directly down the barrel of a mandatory federal prison sentence. The luxurious, socially superior life she had envisioned for her perfect family was burning to absolute ash right in front of her eyes. Slowly, Patricia turned her head and looked directly at me. I was standing tall, calm, and completely untouchable in the center of my warm, secure home. I held the heavy blue ledger securely in my hands, representing the undeniable, crushing power of the documented truth. I was the very daughter she had discarded, like common, useless trash. I was the sinking ship she had completely refused to save when my father died. And now, I was the absolute unquestioned master of her fate. A profound, sickening desperation washed over Patricia's face, replacing the arrogant smirk she had worn just moments before. The proud, cruel woman who had marched into my home to relish my ultimate eviction completely vanished into thin air. Her knees physically buckled beneath her. She sank slowly down onto the imported Persian rug, the soft fabric of her expensive cashmere cardigan pooling around her legs. She fell to her knees right in front of me. She crawled forward on the smooth marble floor. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and tightly grabbed the fabric of my tailored suit skirt. She looked up at me, her face contorted into an ugly, weeping mask of pure, unfiltered terror. "Claire, please!" Patricia wailed, heavy tears pouring down her cheeks and ruining her pristine makeup. Her voice was thick and choked with hysterical, desperate sobs. "Please, you have to stop this right now. You cannot send those files to the federal authorities. You have to call them and tell them you made a terrible mistake. You have to withdraw the whistleblower report today. You cannot do this to Bradley. He is your older brother. He is my only son. If he goes to federal prison, his entire life will be completely destroyed. He will lose everything he has ever worked for. Please, Claire, I am begging you from the bottom of my heart. Look at me. I am your mother. We are your family. We share the exact same blood. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You have to show us some mercy. Please, I will do absolutely anything you ask. We will pay the money back somehow. Just please do not destroy our family." I looked down at the woman, kneeling pathetically at my feet. I looked at her hands, desperately clutching my clothes, seeking a lifeline she had never once offered me. I felt the fabric of my skirt pull against her dead weight. I stood there in the quiet living room, and I searched deep inside my own heart. I looked for even the tiniest spark of empathy, a single shred of daughterly affection, or a brief flicker of maternal connection. I searched for the unconditional love I had desperately craved for 28 long, painful years. I found absolutely nothing. The well was completely and permanently dry. I gently but firmly reached down and pried her shaking fingers off my skirt. I took one smooth, deliberate step backward, removing myself entirely from her desperate grasp. I looked down at her tear-stained face, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy, any anger, or any emotion at all. "I am not your family, Patricia," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying calm through the quiet room. "I am just a lowly maid. I am just a squatter taking up space. I am just a bankrupt failure who could not make it in the real world. Do you remember what you told me 3 years ago when I stood on your driveway, freezing in the winter rain and begging for your help? Do you remember the exact words you used when you locked your front door and left me to freeze in the dark?" Patricia stared up at me, her lips trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with mounting absolute horror. She remembered. I could see the exact moment the memory locked into her panicked, racing mind. "This family does not harbor bankrupt failures," I recited softly, repeating her own vicious words back to her with absolute flawless precision. "You are a sinking ship, Patricia, and I am not drowning with you." A profound, devastating silence fell over the grand foyer. The absolute finality of my words crushed whatever remaining hope they had left. Patricia buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking with loud, ugly, completely hopeless sobs. She wept for the son she could not save and the luxury she would never possess. Bradley was staring blankly at the wall, completely defeated, his arrogant spirit entirely broken by the sheer weight of his own massive incompetence. Chloe was weeping quietly near the console table, realizing she was permanently tied to a sinking anchor that would drag her down to the bottom of the ocean. Richard stood completely frozen by the door, completely out of legal options and entirely out of time. They had come to this house to conquer, to humiliate, and to destroy, and they had been utterly, ruthlessly slaughtered by the very person they had severely underestimated. From the back of the living room, the sharp, heavy sound of thick leather police boots broke the heavy silence. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, his thumbs resting purposefully on his tactical duty belt. His face was a mask of stern, uncompromising legal authority. He had watched the entire confrontation unfold with absolute professional detachment, and he was now ready to conclude the evening. I believe the homeowner has made her position incredibly clear, and she has explicitly asked you all to leave the premises immediately. Sergeant Miller said, his deep, resonant voice commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He looked directly at Richard, then down at Patricia, weeping on the floor, and finally at Bradley. Do I need to place you all in steel handcuffs and arrest you for criminal trespassing right now, or are you going to walk out that door and never return? Sergeant Miller did not have to repeat his threat. The heavy and imposing silence in my grand foyer was completely shattered by the sharp metallic clink of his handcuffs tapping against his thick leather duty belt. Richard was the very first person to move. He looked exactly like a man walking a slow, miserable path to his own execution. He did not look at me. He did not look at Mr. Harrison or the Homeowners Association president. He just stared completely blankly at the imported marble floor beneath his feet and began a slow shuffling walk toward the open front doors. He was completely and utterly defeated. His entire empire of lies, his massive corporate ego, and his predatory arrogance had all crumbled into worthless dust beneath his expensive leather shoes. Bradley, however, was simply not ready to surrender his fragile pride. As Sergeant Miller stepped forward and pointed a firm, commanding hand toward the doorway, Bradley squared his broad shoulders and desperately tried to maintain his shattered illusion of superiority. He pointed a shaking, sweaty finger directly at my face. His features were twisted into a mask of raw, incredibly ugly fury. He shouted loudly that I had not won this war. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he was going to hire the most expensive defense team in the country and that he would be back to take every single thing I loved. I just stood there on the plush Persian rug and watched him unravel. I did not say a single word in response. I did not need to lower myself to his desperate level. Sergeant Miller had absolutely zero patience for the outburst. The veteran police officer stepped right into my brother's personal space, placed a firm, heavy hand squarely onto Bradley's shoulder, and physically rotated him toward the exit. The absolute crushing humiliation of being forcefully guided out of the house by a uniformed law enforcement officer finally silenced my brother. He dropped his arm and stumbled forward toward the porch. Patricia was the last person to leave the living room. She was still kneeling pathetically on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands. Sergeant Miller had to tell her twice to stand up before she finally moved. When she rose to her feet, her expensive designer cashmere cardigan was completely wrinkled and covered in floor dust. Her pristine, perfectly applied makeup was heavily smeared across her pale cheeks in dark, ugly, wet streaks. She reached her shaking hand out toward me one final time, her eyes desperately pleading for a mercy she had never once shown me. I simply took one calm, deliberate step back and stood shoulder to shoulder with Mr. Harrison. My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair that echoed all the way up the grand, sweeping staircase. She turned around and stumbled out the door, leaning heavily against the wooden doorframe just to keep her physical balance. I walked slowly to the front doorway and stood proudly on my grand porch to watch them leave. The crisp autumn air felt incredibly clean and intensely refreshing against my skin. Robert, the Homeowners Association president, stood right beside me, holding his delicate porcelain coffee cup. I was watching the unbelievable spectacle with keen, fascinated interest. Our exclusive gated neighborhood was usually incredibly quiet and deeply private, but Patricia had intentionally left my massive front doors wide open earlier, specifically to make a brutal public scene of my eviction. Her vicious plan had worked perfectly, but the captive audience was now witnessing her complete and total destruction instead. The loud, chaotic commotion had drawn the immediate attention of several wealthy neighbors. An older couple walking their golden retriever stopped completely in their tracks on the pristine sidewalk. A man meticulously trimming his hedges next door lowered his shears and stared openly over the fence. They all watched in absolute stunned silence as Richard, Bradley, Patricia, and Chloe were escorted down the long, winding gravel driveway by a fully uniformed police officer. Patricia continued to wail loudly, her desperate sobs carrying clearly through the crisp evening air for every single person on the street to hear. Chloe walked as far away from Bradley as physically possible, keeping her head down and using her large, expensive designer handbag to shield her tear-stained face from the staring neighbors. She was absolutely mortified to be seen associating with them. I stood tall on the porch and watched their gleaming black Mercedes SUV finally back out of the driveway and speed recklessly away into the gathering twilight. I watched the bright red taillights disappear around the corner, and a profound, overwhelming sense of deep peace washed over my entire body. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath. For 3 long, painful years, I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of their rejection. I had spent countless lonely nights wondering why I was never quite good enough for my own family. But standing there on the porch of my $3 million estate, I finally understood the pure truth. I had always been enough. They were the ones who were fundamentally broken. I felt the final lingering chains of my childhood trauma simply snap and fall away onto the porch. I was finally completely free. The explosive fallout from that fateful evening did not take long to materialize. In fact, the consequences arrived with terrifying, unstoppable speed. I had handed the federal authorities a perfectly organized, comprehensively documented roadmap of massive corporate fraud, and they did not waste a single second executing their absolute mandate. Exactly 3 short weeks after the dramatic showdown in my foyer, the Internal Revenue Service finally moved in. I read all about it in the local business journal while sitting comfortably in my sunlit conservatory drinking my morning coffee. It was a beautifully detailed front-page article. Federal agents from the Criminal Investigation Division had executed massive simultaneous synchronized raids right at the crack of dawn. They aggressively hit the empty commercial warehouse that served as the fake operational headquarters for Apex Heritage Construction, and they raided Richard's plush, towering corporate offices downtown. The newspaper article described in vivid detail how dozens of federal agents wearing dark blue windbreakers carried out towering stacks of bankers' boxes and cloned every single computer hard drive in the entire building. Bradley was officially taken into federal custody, right on his perfectly manicured front lawn in full view of his wealthy suburban neighbors. Richard was arrested while sitting behind his expensive mahogany desk, completely unable to talk his way out of the federal warrants. The local television news channels ran the shocking story for days on end. It was a massive, scandalous spectacle. 2 prominent, seemingly wealthy businessmen were being federally indicted on dozens of serious counts of corporate wire fraud, tax evasion, and the systematic, cruel financial exploitation of a highly vulnerable, elderly woman. The federal government did not offer them any leniency. Their personal and business bank accounts were immediately permanently frozen. Their luxury vehicles were swiftly seized by federal marshals and loaded onto flatbed tow trucks. The government ruthlessly locked down every single asset tied to their names to ensure the stolen funds could eventually be recovered and returned to the trust. Chloe reacted exactly the way anyone who truly knew her selfish nature would expect. She did not stand bravely by her husband in his darkest hour. She did not offer Bradley a single ounce of loyalty, devotion, or emotional support. The absolute second she realized her luxurious, spoiled lifestyle was entirely funded by criminal activity and that the money was completely gone forever, she completely turned her back on him. Within 48 hours of the massive federal raid, Chloe officially filed for a highly publicized, incredibly messy divorce. She hired an aggressive, cutthroat family attorney and immediately began giving tearful statements to the local press, claiming she was a totally innocent, deeply betrayed victim who had absolutely no idea her husband was a financial monster. She mercilessly dragged Bradley's name through the absolute lowest layers of the public mud, desperately hoping to completely distance herself from the incoming wave of severe federal indictments. The shallow alliance of pure greed that had fueled their marriage completely shattered into a million pieces the very moment the stolen money ran out. While Bradley and Richard sat miserably in cold federal holding cells, waiting for their highly publicized arraignments, the final heavy domino in their glorious collapse finally tipped over. It happened on a very quiet, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at the massive antique desk in my private library, calmly reviewing some standard investment portfolios for the estate trust. My cell phone vibrated softly on the polished wood surface. I glanced down at the bright screen and saw an unknown local number. Against my better judgment, I accepted the call, but I did not say a single word into the receiver. I just sat back in my chair and listened. It was an automated voicemail recording. The voice on the other end of the line was trembling, ragged, and completely broken. It was Patricia. "Claire," she sobbed loudly, her voice cracking violently with every single desperate word. "Claire, please pick up the phone right now. I know you hate me. I know you never want to see my face again, but I have absolutely nowhere else to go in this world. You have to help me. I am begging you on my hands and knees." I sat back in my heavy leather desk chair and listened closely to the sound of my mother completely falling apart. She was frantically hyperventilating, gasping for shallow air between her panicked words. I could clearly hear the heavy sound of rain drumming loudly against a car roof in the background. "The bank was here today, Claire," she wept miserably. "The county sheriff deputies came to the house this morning. They are taking my home away from me. They are physically changing the locks right now. Bradley lied to me. He completely and totally lied to me. When his fake contracting business started failing last year, before he married Chloe, he came to me begging for financial help. He told me he just needed a temporary loan to keep his company afloat until a big project paid out. He convinced me to let him take out a massive second mortgage on my house. He promised me he would pay it all back as soon as his big commercial contracts came through. He swore to me on his life that I would never, ever lose the family house." I closed my eyes and let out a slow, quiet breath. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of Bradley's sociopathic manipulation was truly staggering. He had not only stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from a dying old woman, he had actively and maliciously financially ruined his own trusting mother just to cover up his spectacular business failures. But the federal agents froze all of his personal accounts. Patricia continued, her voice rapidly devolving into a frantic, high-pitched wail of pure terror. "They seized the exact money he was using to make the monthly mortgage payments. The bank formally foreclosed on me, Claire. They took the house. They took absolutely everything I own. I am sitting in my car right now with 2 small suitcases, and I do not have a single dollar to my name. All of my country club friends have completely blocked my phone number because of the massive public scandal. I have absolutely nothing left in this world. Please, Claire, I am your mother. You have that massive, beautiful estate. You have all those empty, warm bedrooms. Please, let me come stay with you. I will clean the floors. I will cook your meals. I will do absolutely anything you want me to do. Just please do not leave me out here in the freezing cold." The voicemail clicked sharply and ended, leaving my quiet library bathed in total peaceful silence. I sat there, staring at the blank, dark screen of my cellular phone. The poetic justice of the situation was so incredibly profound, it was almost difficult to properly process. The exact same cruel woman who had looked me directly in the eye 3 years ago and told me she would never harbor a bankrupt failure was now desperately begging to sleep in my spare bedroom. The mother who had watched me cry uncontrollably on her driveway as she callously threw my garbage bags into the freezing rain was now sitting alone in her own car with nothing but suitcases and a completely shattered reality. She was officially and completely homeless. She had confidently bet her entire life, her entire social identity, and her entire maternal loyalty on a golden child who turned out to be nothing more than a parasitic, destructive criminal. She had willingly chosen greed and status over unconditional love, and now she was weeping as she reaped the exact bitter harvest she had so carefully sown. I felt absolutely no urge to rescue her from her own consequences. I felt zero obligation to throw a life preserver to a sinking ship. She had explicitly and repeatedly taught me that family members who fail financially are completely disposable burdens. I was simply honoring the harsh, brutal lesson she had so forcefully demanded I learn all those years ago. I did not call her back. I did not send her a text message. I did not offer her a single solitary penny of Evelyn Hughes's legally protected wealth. I simply pressed my finger against the delete button on my screen, erasing her desperate voice from my life completely and forever. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk, walked slowly over to the large library window, and looked out over my beautiful, peaceful gardens. The dark storm clouds had finally passed, and the evening sky was perfectly clear. It is a quiet Sunday morning, and I am standing in the sunlit conservatory of my beautiful home. This is the exact same room where Evelyn and I first sat together, surrounded by towering piles of chaotic financial records. The bright morning light is pouring through the tall glass windows. It warms the polished hardwood floors and casts a beautiful golden glow over the indoor plants I have carefully cultivated over the past few months. Outside the window, I can see the expansive estate gardens. They are no longer choked by thick weeds or dying from years of intentional neglect. The antique rose bushes are blooming with vibrant red and white petals. The winding stone pathways have been meticulously scrubbed clean. The heavy, suffocating shadow of decay that Richard and Bradley had cast over this magnificent estate is completely and permanently gone. I take a slow, deep breath of the fresh morning air, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I run my fingers gently along the smooth wooden frame of Evelyn's favorite velvet armchair. I think about her every single day. I think about the sharp, intelligent spark in her eyes when she realized I was actually going to fight the wolves for her. I think about the fierce, quiet determination she showed when she signed those irrevocable trust documents. She was a woman who was physically fading away, but her beautiful spirit remained incredibly strong until her very last breath. She trusted me with her life, and she trusted me with her legacy. I promised her I would protect this house from the predators who wanted to tear it apart, and I kept that promise. Evelyn Hughes did not just leave me a massive $3 million estate. She did not just leave me a high-yield investment portfolio or a collection of priceless antique furniture. She left me something infinitely more valuable than any amount of money in the world. She gave me the absolute, undeniable permission to finally stand up for myself. For 28 years, I had been conditioned to believe that I was entirely worthless. My mother, Patricia, had spent my entire childhood treating me like a disposable burden. My brother Bradley had spent his entire life taking up all the space in the room and pushing me down into the dirt. They taught me to accept their cruelty as if it was a normal, natural part of life. They trained me to shrink myself so they could feel huge and powerful. But Evelyn saw right through all of that noise. In just a few short months, she gave me more maternal grace, more genuine respect, and more unconditional love than my own biological family had given me in almost 3 decades. She saw my meticulous attention to detail not as a boring trait, but as a brilliant weapon. She saw my quiet nature not as weakness, but as a deep, calculating strength. She looked at me, and she saw a daughter. In my profession as a corporate auditor, I spent years learning how to strictly balance complex ledgers. I learned that every single transaction leaves a permanent mark. Money cannot simply disappear into thin air. It has to go somewhere. The numbers always tell a clear story if you are patient enough to read them. But for the first 28 years of my life, I completely ignored the emotional ledger of my own family. I kept depositing all of my love, all of my time, and all of my energy into my mother and my brother. I kept making massive emotional deposits into their lives, and I never once received a single return on my investment. The balance was always zero. They drained my account every single day, and then they had the absolute nerve to tell me I was the one who was morally bankrupt. Evelyn Hughes was the very first person who ever balanced my ledger. She saw the immense value in my quiet dedication, and she rewarded my loyalty with unwavering trust. Standing here in the quiet warmth of this beautiful home, I have finally come to understand the absolute truth about what family actually means. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. We are taught from a very young age that we must always forgive our parents and blindly support our siblings, no matter how terribly they treat us. We are conditioned to carry the crushing weight of their endless mistakes simply because we share the same last name. We are told that we have to keep showing up to holiday dinners and family gatherings just to be mocked and belittled because that is simply what families do. But that is a toxic, dangerous lie. Blood is nothing more than biological chance. True family is not determined by a birth certificate or a shared genetic code. True family is determined by who actively steps up to protect you when you are at your absolute most vulnerable. When my own father was dying a slow, agonizing death, Patricia and Bradley completely abandoned him. They took luxury vacations to Europe and left me alone to wipe his forehead and manage his pain. When I ran out of money and desperately needed a safe place to stay, my mother locked me out in the freezing winter rain and told me I was a sinking ship. That is what my blood relatives did to me when I needed them the most. But when Evelyn realized that I was willing to sacrifice my corporate career to shield her from a greedy nephew, she did not use me and throw me away. She pulled me close. She gave me the legal tools I needed to build an impenetrable fortress around us both. She was not related to me by blood, but she was the only true mother figure I have ever known. She gave me the greatest gift a parent can ever give a child. She gave me safety, and by giving me that safety, she gave me the power to completely destroy the monsters who had haunted my entire life. People often ask me if I feel any guilt about what happened to my mother and my brother. They wonder if I lose sleep over the fact that Bradley is sitting in a federal prison cell or that Patricia is living out of 2 suitcases with absolutely nowhere to go. They ask if walking away from my own flesh and blood makes me feel cold or heartless. The honest answer is that I do not feel cold at all. I feel incredibly warm. I feel safe. I feel completely secure in my own skin. When you finally cut off toxic family members, the world expects you to feel a deep sense of loss. Society expects you to grieve the relationship, but the truth is, I had already done all my grieving. I grieved for the mother I never had while I was sitting alone on that wet driveway 3 years ago. I grieved for the brother I lost when he stood there and watched me shiver in the cold without lifting a single finger to help me. By the time they showed up at my grand estate demanding keys and security codes, there was absolutely nothing left to mourn. They were just greedy strangers standing in my foyer. It is a profoundly liberating moment when you look at the people who terrorized your youth and realize they hold absolutely no power over your mind anymore. Their words are just empty noise. Walking away from toxic, abusive people does not make you a cruel person. It makes you a survivor. It makes you someone who finally recognizes your own inherent value. You do not owe your presence to people who only want you around when you are useful to them. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. I look out over the sweeping green hills of my property, and I realize that sometimes the most beautiful life is built directly on the ashes of the one you were forced to leave behind. If my mother had not thrown me out onto that freezing driveway 3 years ago, I never would have possessed the desperate, fiery drive to become a ruthless corporate auditor. If I had not learned how to trace hidden money to survive, I never would have been able to expose Bradley's fraudulent contracting company. Every single cruel thing they did to me ultimately forged me into the exact weapon that was required to dismantle their entire greedy empire. Their towering arrogance was their downfall, and my quiet endurance was my ultimate victory. The noise of their constant demands, their belittling comments, and their endless toxic drama has been completely erased from my world. In its place, there is only this beautiful, profound silence. I wake up every single morning and I breathe in the quiet air of a life I built through hard work and total integrity. I manage Evelyn's charitable trusts, ensuring that her massive wealth goes toward helping vulnerable elderly people who do not have anyone to advocate for them. I use the very resources my family tried to steal to protect people who are exactly like Evelyn. It is the perfect lasting legacy. I am taking the worst parts of my past and turning them into something incredibly good. I know that there are so many people listening to my story right now who know exactly what it feels like to be the family scapegoat. I know there are people out there who are currently bending over backward, trying to earn the love of a mother who constantly criticizes them, or a sibling who constantly uses them for financial gain. You are carrying a heavy, agonizing burden on your shoulders every single day. You are constantly told that you are too sensitive, or that you are overreacting, or that you need to be the bigger person and just forgive and forget. You are draining your own bank accounts and sacrificing your own mental health just to keep the peace in a family that goes to war with you, the absolute second you stop being convenient. You show up to the family dinners, you bring the gifts, you do the chores, and you are still treated like an outsider in your own home. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I have stood exactly where you are standing right now. I know how badly it hurts to realize the people who are supposed to love you the most are actually the ones causing you the most pain. If you are carrying the weight of a family that only sees your value when you are useful to them, it is okay to put that weight down. You do not have to carry it for one more second. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of revenge, it is an act of survival. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. You are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if those people share your DNA. You are allowed to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. You have the right to build a life that is peaceful, secure, and entirely your own. You do not need their permission to succeed, and you certainly do not need their approval to be happy. If this story gave you a sense of justice and peace, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells me that these stories are helping people, and I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a toxic relative? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know what state you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Thank you for listening. You deserve to be protected too. I will see you in the next story.